The aftermath of the intense clash left the area in complete ruins. Amid the devastation, Cyan and Gunther continued their duel. Cyan pressed forward with relentless strikes, landing a solid elbow before winding up for another blow. His piercing gaze locked onto Gunther as he demanded, "Where's Lena Nilov?" Gunther, sweat dripping from his brow, blocked the attack with a grimace. His teeth clenched as he snarled, "Why are you dragging her into this?" His anger flared, and with a furious expression, he shouted, "Don't underestimate me." With all his might, Gunther launched a devastating blow. Cyan narrowly avoided it, leaping aside at the last second. His sharp reflexes saved him by a hair. Landing lightly, Cyan began to analyze his opponent's moves. Observing carefully, he quickly realized Gunther's arm wasn't taking any real damage from his strikes. Gunther smirked confidently. "Think you could dodge this?" he taunted. He drove a powerful punch into the ground, unleashing a destructive shockwave that shattered everything in its path. Cyan dodged again, springing to safety on some wooden debris. Seeing Cyan avoid the attack so cleanly, Gunther's lips curled into an excited grin. "Not bad. You're even better than I thought." Cyan balanced on the remnants of the destroyed house. Gunther, undeterred, strode toward him and growled, "Get down here. We're not done yet." At this point, Kiram, who had been watching from the sidelines, hesitantly asked, "Should I step in?" Cyan's attention snapped to the side. His eyes narrowed. "Wait, someone else is here." Suddenly, knives descended from the sky, embedding themselves in the ground before Gunther. A stern voice rang out. "Stop!" Gunther froze, his eyes darting to the knives. His confusion was short-lived as he turned toward the source of the voice, his face twisting with rage. "Who dares interfere?" he bellowed. "Do you have a death wish?" Lisa emerged, flanked by guards, her expression cold and commanding. She pointed a knife at Gunther and demanded, "Why are you fighting our client?" Gunther's anger boiled over. He jabbed a finger at Cyan and shouted, "He started it." Lisa scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Stop spouting nonsense," she snapped. "This is just like you, causing problems wherever you go." Gunther gritted his teeth, fists trembling. "I'm not lying. Why do you always blame me for everything?" Their heated argument left Cyan scratching his head in bewilderment. Do these two know each other, he thought, watching their dynamic shift from combatants to bickering acquaintances. Fuming, Gunther turned his back on Lisa and began walking away. "Don't forget about my fight with Simon," he muttered darkly. Lisa watched him leave without saying a word. Cyan, observing the entire exchange, was left utterly puzzled. "What's going on with this guy? He's way more obedient than I expected." And just like that, the tension shifted. The ruins were silent again, but the mystery surrounding these relationships had only deepened. Lisa, clearly worried, approached Cyan. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. Cyan descended gently to the ground, brushing off her concern with a calm, "I'm fine." But his sharp gaze lingered on her, and with a tone of quiet displeasure, he added, "I'm not happy about this." Lisa and the guards panicked. Her hands instinctively rested on her abdomen as she bowed deeply, sweat forming on her brow. "You're a VIP client," she stammered. "We're supposed to take care of you." Cyan tilted his head slightly, observing her anxious demeanor. A small smirk crossed his face as he concluded, "You need a favor." Lisa blinked, caught off guard. "How? How do you know that?" she asked, her voice tinged with surprise. Gunther mentioned he met with the owner. Cyan replied smoothly. "He wanted to fight with me. I wasn't interested, but I'll make a deal." The guards and Lisa exchanged glances, unsure of what he meant. Cyan shifted his gaze to the side, where a young girl who sold cigarettes sat trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Give her a job," Cyan demanded, his tone firm but not unkind. Lisa and the guards followed his gaze and saw the girl. Moved by the sight, Lisa nodded slowly. "It will be done." Hours later, the streets buzzed with whispers of Gunther Lichtis' return to the cage. "Have you heard the news?" one man asked his companion. His friend chuckled. "Yeah, Gunther's crawling out of the dump for a fight with Simon of Lemia." The first man stroked his chin, his expression confident. "Never thought I'd see Gunther back here. Simon's in for it." As night fell, the air in Lambaster was electric. Everywhere, people discussed Cyan's rumored upcoming fight with Gunther. Meanwhile, Cyan spent the week wandering, taking part in smaller skirmishes to learn the rules of the cage. In one match, Cyan swiftly defeated an opponent with a single punch, sending the man sprawling unconscious. Dusting off his shirt casually, he learned the first rule: no weapons allowed. The second rule: if an opponent gives up, the fight is over. The third and final rule: no killing. Cyan filed the rules away in his mind, though he barely needed them. Most of his matches ended with a single blow, leaving little room for complications. The long-awaited day arrived. The cage was packed with spectators, buzzing with anticipation. The judge, a blond man with glasses and a sly grin, stepped forward, extending a hand toward both fighters. Today's fight will be different, he announced. There are no rules. Gunther, arms crossed, broke into a wide, toothy smile. On the other side, Cyan blinked, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. What do you mean, no rules? He asked, pointing at himself for clarification. The judge leaned in with a knowing smile. Exactly as you heard, no rules. The owner allowed it. Cyan's confusion only deepened. He gestured at himself incredulously. You mean no one told me about this? Gunther, clearly relishing the moment, chuckled darkly. You'll figure it out soon enough. The crowd roared as the stakes of this no-holds-barred fight sank in. Cyan's mind raced. What kind of fight is this? He was about to find out. Gunther slipped on brass knuckles, his smirk widening. You have no idea how long I've waited for this, he said, his tone dripping with malice. Cyan's eyes narrowed in disbelief. Spotting the brass knuckles, he turned to the referee in outrage. This is completely unfair. But to Cyan's shock, the referee had vanished into thin air. Gunther chuckled, enjoying Cyan's frustration. The judge's voice echoed through the arena. The fight begins now. The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy electrifying the cage. Among the spectators was Linza, arms crossed, and her body glowing faintly with blue energy. She grinned. Let's see how good you really are, she thought, her anticipation growing. Gunther flexed his arms, the brass knuckles gleaming ominously. Didn't anyone tell you this is a no-rules match? He taunted. Cyan shot him a deadpan look and replied dryly, not entirely. Gunther's smile widened as he activated his powers, his arms hardening to the texture of iron. Grab a weapon if you're scared, he sneered. You'll need it. Annoyed but composed, Cyan closed his eyes, exhaled deeply, and let out a low sigh. I don't need one, he muttered, extending his hands. A cold fog materialized around him as he assumed an offensive stance. I have a better plan, he said confidently. Ready to lose? Gunther's grin grew predatory. The thought of killing Cyan made his blood race. I'll savor this, he said, sticking out his tongue. Humans scream beautifully before they die. He began to fantasize about holding Cyan's skull, his twisted imagination fueling his bloodlust. Cyan's expression hardened. The realization of what Gunther was planning filled him with disgust. So that's how it is, Cyan muttered, his gaze like steel. Gunther's bloodlust surged. First, I'll take your eyes, he declared. In a flash, he closed the distance, appearing in front of Cyan with an iron fist ready to strike. But Cyan was faster. With perfect timing, he sidestepped the blow effortlessly. Extending his hand, he summoned the demonic sword, its ominous form emerging from the fog. Gunther, momentarily caught off guard, left an opening. Cyan didn't waste a second. With a single, precise swing, the sword sliced clean through Gunther's arm. The severed limb flew through the air before landing with a sickening thud. Before anyone could process what had happened, Cyan reappeared behind Gunther, his eyes glowing with cold determination. Calmly, he sheathed the sword, his presence exuding an almost supernatural dominance. Gunther's scream of agony ripped through the arena. Clutching the bloody stump of his arm, he collapsed to his knees, his face twisted in a mixture of pain and disbelief. His once confident eyes were now wide with confusion. What just happened? He stammered, struggling to comprehend the swift turn of events. The crowd fell into stunned silence, unable to believe what they had witnessed. Even Linza, usually composed, raised an eyebrow. So, he's not just talk, she thought with a small, approving smile. As Gunther's screams echoed, Cyan stood motionless, his expression unreadable. In that moment, the arena understood one thing. Cyan wasn't just a fighter. He was a force to be reckoned with. Gunther, clutching his severed arm, turned towards Cyan with a gaze full of rage. I won't forgive you for this, he roared, trembling with anger. Cyan's response was cold and commanding. Don't move if you want to stay alive, he warned, his tone laced with lethal intent. Gunther, for the first time, felt a suffocating pressure unlike anything he had ever experienced. Despite his arrogance, he froze, obeying Cyan's command without question. The referee descended into the ring, glancing at Gunther's silent form before raising his hand towards Cyan. The winner is Cyan, he declared. The spectators erupted in mixed reactions of shock and awe. No one had anticipated such a devastating end to the fight. Gunther, once feared and undefeated, had been utterly humiliated. Among the crowd, a man with a black mustache trembled visibly. His eyes locked onto the ominous black fog and the aura surrounding Cyan's demonic sword. Recognizing the sword's mysterious mana, the man's voice caught in his throat. That's the demonic sword, he whispered, his body shaking as the realization sank in. Cyan sat in the lounge, wiping sweat from his face with a towel. As he cooled off, his mind churned with questions. Someone made sure I wouldn't get any details about the rules, he thought grimly. Could Linza have guessed what I'm up to? Before he could delve further, the girl he had saved from Gunther's subordinates approached him. Her eyes shone with gratitude as she handed him a glass of water. That fight was incredible, she said, her voice full of admiration. Cyan accepted the water, momentarily surprised. Noticing her uniform, he realized she had already started working. She clenched her fists excitedly. Manager Lisa said I should start as an assistant, she explained with a bright smile. Please be kind to me. Cyan smiled softly, patting her on the head. Work hard, he said warmly. The girl closed her eyes, her face lighting up with a grateful expression. Lisa entered the lounge moments later, and Cyan's demeanor shifted. His calm face darkened with fury. What were you thinking today? He scolded, his voice sharp. Lisa, to his surprise, lowered her head in apology. I'm sorry, she said, her voice filled with regret. Cyan paused, his anger turning into confusion. Why didn't you tell me the fight was going to be without rules? He asked, his tone firm but calm. Lisa raised her head, her expression uncertain. I didn't know, she explained. The information was only shared between the owner and Gunther. I should have checked more thoroughly. I'm sorry. Cyan sighed, standing up. I need to meet this owner, he decided, brushing past her. Panic flashed across Lisa's face. That's impossible, she exclaimed, her voice trembling. The owner prefers to remain anonymous. Realizing this approach was futile, Cyan turned back to Lisa with a serious expression. Be more careful from now on, he instructed. Lisa bowed her head once more. Understood, she said softly. As Cyan exited the room, a voice called out. Excuse me, do you have a moment? Cyan turned to face the speaker, his eyes narrowing with confusion. Who are you, he asked. The man, the same one who had watched Cyan's fight with Gunther, placed a hand over his chest and bowed. I am Morris, he introduced himself. From the Gray Merchants Union. Cyan's gaze hardened as he sized up Morris. What does this guy want, he thought. Morris leaned closer to Cyan, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've come to see you because I have a proposal, he said slyly. His gaze sharpened, and with a confident smile, he asked, would you be willing to sell the demonic sword? Cyan immediately went on high alert, his piercing eyes locking onto Morris. I don't know what you're talking about, he replied coldly. Morris chuckled, unfazed. No need to play coy. I'm certain I'm the only one here who recognizes it. His expression turned smug as he began recounting his history. I used to work for the Albus Merchant Union before Zickerman Albus, the head of the union, was killed 2 years ago. Now, I'm with the Gray Merchant Union here in Lambaster. Weapons are my specialty, swords especially. I've supplied them even to the Garum Association. Cyan stayed silent, his gaze seemingly distant as he processed the information. Morris continued, his enthusiasm growing. I know weapons better than anyone else. The demonic sword of the Dark Mist. It's been waiting for its rightful owner for years. And now here it is. Morris stepped closer, practically quivering with excitement. Name your price, he urged. I'll pay anything. For a moment, Cyan remained motionless. Then, with cold precision, he grabbed Morris by the neck and hoisted him into the air. Morris's eyes bulged with panic as he gasped for air, clawing at Cyan's arm. Am I the only one who knows? Cyan asked darkly, his voice as sharp as the sword in question. Morris's panic deepened, foam forming at the corners of his mouth. But before Cyan could finish him, movement in the shadows caught his attention. A masked figure stepped into the room, followed by another emerging from Cyan's shadow, and then a third. In an instant, 3 masked men surrounded Cyan, drawing their weapons. Release him, one of them ordered, their tone icy. Unless you want to die. Cyan glanced around, sizing them up. His expression shifted from focused to amused. Funny, he muttered, his smile widening. You really think these guys can stop me? The masked men remained unfazed, their weapons aimed and ready. But Cyan sharp, I quickly identified their style and formation. Shadow Assassin Squad of Sparnia, he thought. Morris didn't come unprepared. Tightening his grip on Morris's neck, Cyan sneered. Do you honestly think these mercenaries will save you? Morris's breaths grew weaker, his eyes filling with desperation. Cyan's calm demeanor gave way to a flash of rage. Let's test that theory. The door suddenly burst open, and Lisa entered, followed by the girl Cyan had saved earlier. Lisa's eyes widened at the scene. Her hand instinctively moved to her daggers as she assessed the situation. What's going on here? She demanded, her voice steady despite the tension. The girl covered her mouth in shock, her face pale at the sight of Cyan, holding Morris by the neck. Lisa, however, remained calm, drawing her daggers with a steady hand. Whatever this is, I suggest resolving it with words, she said coolly, addressing the masked men. Otherwise, I'll have to use force. The masked men didn't flinch, their weapons still trained on Cyan. The tension in the room grew thick, but Cyan's icy smile remained unshaken. Let's see how far they're willing to take this, he thought, preparing for the inevitable clash. Hearing Louise's worried voice, Cyan turned to see her trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. Her obvious fear tugged at something inside him. This could drag her in too, he thought, irritation flashing across his face. With a sigh, he released Morris's neck, causing the man to collapse to the ground. Gasping for air, his expression twisted in panic. Cyan's cold voice cut through the tense air. I'll forgive you this time, but get out of here before I change my mind. The masked men tensed, one turning to Morris for instructions. Morris, still clutching his neck and wheezing, raised a shaky hand. Put the weapons away, he croaked. The men obeyed, sheathing their blades, though their wary eyes never left Cyan. Regaining some composure, Morris approached Cyan, his smug demeanor returning. You're upset, he noted, adjusting his posture. It seems I've overstayed my welcome. Placing his hand on his chest, Morris bowed slightly. But my offer stands. Think carefully about it. Without waiting for a response, Morris and his men turned and left the room. Cyan's sharp gaze followed them as they disappeared, his mind turning to the Gray Merchants Union. He recalled it was a new organization formed in the chaos following Zickerman Albus's death, a group that seemed eager to meddle in dangerous affairs. As Cyan pondered, Louise approached, her voice trembling. Are you okay? She asked, her tears betraying her fear. Cyan looked down at her, his expression softening. I'm fine, he said calmly. Still shaken, Louise confessed. Those people were terrifying. Her voice wavered, and her tears began to fall again. Cyan placed a comforting hand on her head, his touch steady and reassuring. Don't worry, he said gently, stroking her hair. The gesture seemed to calm her as she took a deep breath and nodded. Looking over at Lisa, Cyan's tone turned serious. I have a favor to ask. Lisa's curiosity piqued. What is it? She asked cautiously. I want to meet the owner of Lambaster Cage, Cyan said, his piercing gaze unwavering. Lisa's eyes widened in surprise and concern. That's not an easy request, she murmured, unsure how to respond. Meanwhile, in the slums of the city, Gunther was on a rampage. The bandaged stump where his arm used to be throbbed, but the pain was drowned out by his blinding anger. His furious shouts echoed through the alleyways as he destroyed anything in his path. Cyan, he roared, his voice dripping with hatred. His men, hovering nervously nearby, tried to calm him. Boss, you need to stop, one pleaded. You're wound. Shut up, Gunther snapped, his bloodshot eyes narrowing. I'll die if I don't kill him. His teeth clenched so tightly they nearly cracked, his entire being consumed by his thirst for revenge. Gunther's rage wasn't just anger. It was an unrelenting obsession. His men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if their boss would ever be the same again. Gunther's rage turned into a twisted determination as he recalled the fight with Cyan. The piercing gaze of the younger warrior had made him feel utterly powerless, a humiliation he couldn't bear. Falling to his knees, Gunther pressed a hand to his face, desperately trying to devise a way to bring Cyan down. Then, a spark of hope ignited in his mind. The image of the girl who sold cigarettes surfaced in his thoughts. Slowly removing his hand from his face, his lips curled into a sinister smile. That's it, he murmured. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a card from the Grey Guild. A plan began to take shape. Hours later, back at Lambaster Cage, Louise was busy carrying towels, her mind focused on her tasks. Suddenly, the door creaked open. Turning toward the sound, she froze. Standing there, radiating malice, was Gunther. His lips stretched into an evil grin as he greeted her. Louise's eyes widened in fear, her face paling as sweat began to bead on her forehead. She recognized him instantly. Gunther approached, crouching to her level and placing a heavy hand on her head. His terrifying smile grew wider. Remember me? He asked, his voice dripping with menace. Louise trembled violently, her terror palpable. Why yes, she stammered, her voice barely audible. Gunther let out a maniacal laugh. Good, he said, his tone suddenly desperate. Now will you help me? Meanwhile, on the second floor, Cyan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Lisa. Why can't I meet her? He asked, his tone steady but firm. I need to file an official complaint. Lisa crossed her arms, her demeanor resolute. She's not someone you can meet just because you want to, she replied coolly. Cyan's piercing gaze didn't waver. Why are you defending Linza Nyloff so much? She pressed. Hearing the name, Lisa's expression shifted and her body tensed. She turned her full attention to him, realizing he wasn't an ordinary man. Her voice dropped as she replied, Linza is watching you. She revealed that Linza had been the one to approve the fight with Gunther and the change in the rules. Her serious tone turned to warning as she added, you should leave this place. If you stay, you could end up dead. Cyan's expression remained calm, though her words left him puzzled. He couldn't discern her true loyalties. Was she genuinely loyal to her job, or did she have other motives? Suddenly, screams echoed through the building, cutting through their conversation like a knife. Cyan and Lisa snapped to attention. Lisa's face paled. "That's Louise," she exclaimed, fear creeping into her voice. Without hesitation, she bolted down the stairs, Cyan following closely. Reaching the first floor, they were met with a scene of destruction. A massive hole gaped in the wall, and the reception desk lay in ruins. Dust and debris filled the air, and the chaos sent shockwaves through the building. Lisa's eyes darted around the room, searching for Louise. Cyan scanned the destruction with a sharp, focused gaze, already piecing together the cause of the chaos. Gunther, he thought grimly. The scene of destruction left Lisa in shock. "Who could have done this?" she murmured, her voice laced with disbelief. Meanwhile, Cyan crouched amidst the rubble, scanning the area for clues. His sharp eyes caught something, a bloodied badge. Picking it up, he examined it closely, his expression darkening as he recognized it as Louise's. Lisa, standing behind him, leaned closer. "What is that?" she asked, her tone tinged with curiosity and concern. Cyan pocketed the badge and stood, his resolve firm. "I'm going to find her," he said curtly, turning toward the exit. "Stay here." Lisa's eyes widened in alarm. "Wait, we don't even know who's responsible," she protested, her worry evident. But before she could continue, an overwhelming pressure filled the room, freezing her in place. Cyan turned back, his gaze piercing and full of rage. "I know exactly who it is," he growled before walking away, leaving Lisa speechless and shaken by the sheer intensity of his presence. Elsewhere in the city, portraits lay scattered across the floor of a chaotic bedroom. Delkia, lying on her bed, her face heavy with sleep, barely reacted when Morris entered. His composed demeanor stood in stark contrast to the disarray. "A lady's room shouldn't be this messy," he remarked with a smile, arms behind his back. Delkia cracked an eye open and, without moving, muttered, "Do you want to die for entering without permission?" Unbothered by her threat, Morris walked further into the room. "You're a mess," he said lightly, picking up a portrait from the floor. Delkia groaned, lifting her head slightly. "What are you doing here, Morris?" she asked, her tone uninterested. Morris examined the portrait in his hand, noting the faint, unfinished face on it. "Isn't it obvious?" he replied, stepping closer. "A merchant like me is here to make an offer." Delkia waved him off lazily. "I don't like trades," she said, flopping her head back down. Ignoring her dismissal, Morris studied the portrait further. "This boy, you've fallen for him, haven't you?" he observed. His comment sparked Delkia's curiosity. She sat up slightly, her gaze narrowing. "What do you know about that?" Morris didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his pocket, producing a small glass vial filled with a shimmering liquid. He held it up for her to see, a confident smile spreading across his face. "This," he said, "is the most potent paralyzing potion in all of Garum Kingdom. With this you can have that boy." Delkia, still sprawled on her bed, extended her hand lazily toward the vial. Her curious gaze fixed on the potion. "What do you want in return?" she asked, her voice detached. Morris stepped back, his smile unwavering. "Only one thing," he said, his tone smooth. "Something the boy possesses. You can keep the rest." Delkia inspected the potion, turning the vial over in her hand. "That's all?" she asked skeptically, her interest piqued. Morris began to retreat toward the door, extending a hand in a dismissive gesture. "That's all," he confirmed. "I'll be waiting eagerly for your answer." With that, he exited, leaving Delkia with the potion and her swirling thoughts. Morris left Delkia's room with a sinister smile, his thoughts consumed with his plan. "It doesn't matter who this Simon is," he mused. "As long as he's out of the picture, the sword will be mine." For now, he decided to wait and let Gunther handle Cyan, confident that the brute's thirst for revenge would do the dirty work. In the slums, Gunther sat atop a coffin, his grin wide and unhinged. Across from him stood Cyan, whose piercing gaze demanded answers. "Where's the girl?" Cyan asked directly, his voice cutting through the tense air. Gunther smirked and pulled something from the coffin, tossing it towards Cyan. "Here's a keepsake," he said mockingly. The object landed near Cyan's feet. It was an ear still covered in fresh blood. Cyan's eyes widened, dread creeping into his expression as he feared the worst. Gunther's smug laughter filled the silence as he ran a hand across the coffin's surface. "The rest is in here," he taunted. "Care to take a look?" Cyan's energy flared, his rage igniting like a wildfire. His lips curled into a vengeful smile. "You should have said earlier that you wanted to die." Gunther laughed maniacally in response. Slimy, black energy began to ooze from the stump of his severed arm, coalescing into a grotesque, writhing form. His grin widened, his voice trembling with a mix of madness and excitement. "That's more like it. Come at me, Cyan." Back at Lambaster Cage, Lisa sat in a chair, a sly smile playing on her lips. Do you think Gunther will kill Cyan? She asked casually. Across from her, Lisa stood stiffly, her hands resting on her abdomen. She stared at the floor, her face troubled. No, she answered quietly, her voice devoid of certainty. Lisa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You seem worried about him. Lisa shook her head, forcing composure into her tone. It's been a long time since I had any attachment to him. Curious, Lisa tilted her head. Then why do you seem so invested? She asked, resting her head on her hand. After a moment, she decided to push further. Do you even remember Cyan's face? Lisa froze at the question, her expression shifting from troubled to shocked. Her eyes widened as she realized the truth. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't recall Cyan's face. Why can't I remember? She murmured, her voice trembling with confusion. Lisa's serene smile deepened as she raised her hand, revealing a ring on her finger. From the ring, a crimson fog began to seep, radiating an ominous power. This is one of Eru's authorities, she explained calmly. The ability to make people forget the user's face. Lisa's eyes filled with disbelief. Eru, the god of darkness, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lisa nodded, the red fog swirling ominously. That's right, she said, her tone chilling. Lisa's smile widened, her calm demeanor only heightening Lisa's panic. Yes, she affirmed. It seems my past has caught up to me. Lisa, startled, asked, Am I in danger? Her voice was shaky, betraying her growing unease. Lisa chuckled softly, placing a hand over her chest. Not at all, she replied confidently. It's been a long time since we've had such a valuable guest. Her gaze hardened slightly. Make sure to treat him appropriately. Lisa, still shaken, nodded reluctantly, unsure whether Lisa's confidence was reassuring or ominous. Meanwhile, in the slums, Gunther's blood-forged arm pulsed with malevolent energy, fully regenerated and ready for combat. His face lit with twisted excitement as he sprinted towards Cyan. Are you ready? He shouted gleefully. Slamming his blood-red hand into the ground, Gunther unleashed a shockwave of raw power. Cyan had no time to react as the force hurled him backward. Gritting his teeth, he dug his feet into the ground, skidding for several seconds before managing to stop. Gunther stomped the ground, cracking it beneath his feet. What's wrong? He taunted. Why aren't you using that ability from before? His gaze sharpened as his lips curled into a manic grin. Come on, try harder. Cyan, regaining his composure, glanced to the side and froze. The fight had unearthed human remains scattered throughout the area. Shock filled his face as he realized the ground beneath them was a burial ground. Gunther crouched and picked up a skull, holding it aloft. Do you know why these things are here? He sneered. Because they're useless. This place is a junkyard. With a crushing grip, Gunther shattered the skull into pieces. His expression turned cold and cruel as he declared, Lambaster is full of trash. Memories began to flood his mind, and his smile faltered for just a moment. Gunther recalled his childhood, growing up in the junkyard alongside Lisa. They were mocked relentlessly, living among filth and debris. Yet, even as a child, Gunther had stood in front of Lisa to protect her, no matter the cost. As he grew older, life didn't get easier. He found himself beaten and humiliated countless times, forced to survive by any means necessary, even biting those who threatened them. Then one day, their lives took a dramatic turn. A boy appeared, drawing a sword and pressing it against the neck of one of their tormentors. The man begged for mercy, but the boy's icy expression never wavered. Without hesitation, he thrust the sword into the man's chest, ending his life. The ground behind him was littered with corpses. Gunther and Lisa watched in terrified awe as the boy, unfazed, sheathed his sword and approached them. I left Lewin Academy for some fun, the boy said with a calm, almost angelic smile. Now, all the trash is cleaned up. It was Askel, extending his hand toward them. Askel added, You're safe now. Gunther's eyes filled with admiration. That moment became a defining point in his life. From then on, Askel was a figure of reverence in Gunther's mind. He swore to one day emulate him and cleanse all the trash in Lambaster. Gunther worked tirelessly to gain strength and influence, eventually becoming the manager of the junkyard. He turned the cage matches in Lambaster into a bloodbath, massacring opponents to earn money. Killing his opponents didn't faze him. To him, they were just more trash to dispose of. This ruthless behavior caused Lisa to turn her back on him, cutting all ties. But Gunther didn't care. She was too weak to understand, he thought. His smile remained, unwavering and confident. Because I am one with the junkyard. Now, standing across from Cyan, Gunther's resolve burned brighter than ever. This fight will prove it, he thought. I'll dispose of this trash, just like all the others. Gunther's eyes glimmered with twisted excitement as he fantasized about one day ridding Lambaster of all its so-called trash. But But his reverie was cut short when Cyan, his voice sharp and firm, interrupted. "Enough of this nonsense," Cyan said, standing tall despite the chaos around them. Gunther's grin faltered, replaced with a moment of shock. Cyan smirked confidently, brushing himself off. "What's wrong? Can't you see I'm perfectly fine?" he mocked. "Try a little harder. Why don't you?" Gunther's shock quickly melted into exhilaration. "This is what I've been waiting for," he thought as he activated his ability Scapels. A viscous energy poured from his arm, pulling in every metallic object nearby. Chains, gears, debris, all of it fusing grotesquely into his limb. His arm now resembled a monstrous amalgamation of metal and raw energy. Gunther pulled a purple cube from his pocket, holding it up with a smug grin. "Let me show you something more interesting," he said as the cube began to float. Cyan's calm eyes fixed on the artifact, immediately recognizing it as an ancient relic. Where did he get that, he wondered. Gunther activated the artifact, revealing its name. "This is the gravity chamber," he boasted. The cube expanded rapidly, encapsulating Cyan inside and slamming shut with a deafening thud. Cyan felt a sudden, immense pressure as the gravitational force multiplied 20-fold, rooting him in place. His expression momentarily showed surprise, but quickly hardened into resolve. Gunther grinned like a maniac. "Let's see how long you can last," he sneered, his massive, metallic arm looming as he prepared to crush Cyan. Despite the immense pressure, Cyan remained calm, his body steady. Kiram's voice rang out in his mind. "Do you need help?" "No," Cyan replied flatly. His voice brimmed with quiet fury. "I don't need anyone's help." Gunther, unaware of Cyan's resolve, continued his assault. "Let's see if you can survive this," he roared, swinging his massive arm with enough force to crush anything in its path. But when the blow landed, the cube shattered. Cyan was no longer inside. Gunther froze, his grin fading into confusion. Before he could process what had happened, Cyan appeared beside him, moving at blinding speed. Gunther's eyes widened in disbelief. "How?" Cyan didn't give him time to finish the thought. With all his strength, Cyan delivered a devastating punch to Gunther's chest. The impact was so powerful that Gunther's metallic arm began to disintegrate, pieces of fused metal clattering to the ground as his body was hurled into the air. Gunther gasped, his face twisted in shock. This shouldn't be possible, he thought, his mind racing. His chest burned with pain, and he struggled to comprehend how Cyan had not only escaped but struck back with such ferocity. As he crashed to the ground, Gunther lay amidst the shattered remains of his arm, his confidence shattered along with it. Cyan stood nearby, calm and unyielding, his gaze filled with quiet determination. "This ends now," Cyan muttered. As Gunther was flung into the air, Cyan appeared above him, his piercing gaze fixed on his opponent. Feeling Cyan's overwhelming presence, Gunther instinctively went on high alert. The intensity of Cyan's stare sent shivers down his spine. "I'm going to crush everything," Cyan said coldly, "except your ears." Gunther's fear mounted as he began sweating profusely. Before he could react, Cyan delivered a devastating kick to his back, followed by a brutal elbow strike to his abdomen. The force sent Gunther hurtling toward the ground. While Gunther plummeted, Cyan hurled 6 sharp crystals, embedding them deep into Gunther's body, eliciting cries of pain. Gunther crashed into the rubble below, the impact kicking up a massive curtain of smoke. As the dust settled, his broken body lay sprawled among the debris, sharp crystals jutting out from his flesh. Blood oozed from his wounds as Cyan descended to the ground, approaching him with an unrelenting aura of dominance. Gunther, coughing blood, gazed at Cyan and smiled faintly. "I accept it," he muttered. "Defeat was always my destiny." Cyan clenched his fist, his eyes downcast, silent as he processed Gunther's surrender. With his voice weakening, Gunther continued. "I have no regrets," he said mockingly, blood dribbling from his lips. "That girl, she's Lambaster's trash. Born in this city, destined to die like trash. Just like me. And Lisa," Gunther's grin widened, his voice rasping with confidence. "But you're different. Make sure this doesn't happen to her." Gunther's words hit Cyan like a blow, leaving him in shock and filled with questions. What did he mean by rules of the city? Who was enforcing them? Before Cyan could ask, Gunther's breathing slowed, and within moments his life slipped away. Cyan turned his gaze to the coffin, now ominously silent. Climbing over the debris, he carefully lifted the lid. What he saw inside made his eyes widen in shock. Not long after, Lisa and her men arrived at the scene. Taking in the devastation, Lisa's face grew grim. She spotted Gunther's lifeless body in the middle of the junkyard and froze. Concern flickered across her expression, but she quickly masked it. Turning to one of her men, she said firmly, "Ensure our VIP client is safe." The man bowed respectfully before moving to comply. Just then, a movement caught their attention. Lisa and her men turned toward the source, and their eyes widened in surprise. Emerging from the wreckage was Cyan, holding the girl's lifeless body from the coffin in his arms. Dust-covered and bloodied, but very much alive, he approached them silently. Lisa's voice wavered as she took a step forward. "Cyan, what are you doing?" she asked, her eyes filled with shock and worry. She struggled to believe what she was seeing, her heart racing as she tried to piece together what had transpired. Cyan, cradling the girl's body, turned toward Lisa. His sincere expression eased her growing panic as he calmly explained, "She's fine, just asleep." Relieved, Lisa approached with her guards, kneeling on the ground to take the girl from Cyan's arms. Her worried eyes scanned the girl for any injuries, but as Cyan had said, there were none. "Are you okay?" Lisa asked, her voice still tinged with concern. "I'm fine," Cyan replied firmly. He glanced down at the girl one last time before standing and turning his back to them. "Take good care of her." Lisa noticed his hand clenching into a tight fist, and a sense of unease washed over her. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. Without looking back, Cyan replied, "To clean." Lisa's confusion deepened. "What do you mean, clean?" she asked, her tone uncertain. Cyan continued walking, his steps deliberate and heavy with purpose. His voice was cold but resolute as he declared, "I'm going to clean Lambaster." Lambaster was a fractured city divided into 4 districts, with Lambaster Cage at its center. To the west lay the junkyard, the commercial district stretched to the east, and the entertainment district sprawled to the south. With no formal authority to enforce security, the city's power balance had devolved into chaos. The strong preyed on the weak, unchecked by any higher power. Yet, a semblance of order was maintained by a loose system controlled by the administrators of each district: Linza, Morris, Delkia, and Gunther. Their influence kept the city in its wretched state, but their ambitions also sowed the seeds of its self-destruction. As Cyan walked, his mind drifted to a moment from his past life, trailing behind his brother, Askell. "How are you going to conquer a place like this?" Cyan had asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "If it were a normal country, we could just declare war. But Lambaster isn't normal. Shouldn't I just go alone and take care of the city administrators?" Askell had simply smiled, his confidence unshaken. "That won't be necessary," he replied, leaving Cyan puzzled. "Why not?" Cyan pressed, still unsure. Askell's smile remained as he explained, "They'll destroy themselves. All we need to do is arrive in time to take control." Cyan had been suspicious of his brother's certainty back then. "How can you be so sure?" Askell stopped and turned to face him, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "Because this city is rotten," he said with quiet conviction. "I've seen it with my own eyes." At the time, Cyan had been unsettled by Askell's unshakable confidence. But now, as he walked through the ruined streets of Lambaster, he realized his brother had been right. The city was indeed rotten to its core, a place ruled by greed, cruelty, and self-destruction. With each step, Cyan's resolve hardened. "It's time to clean it all up," he thought grimly. Starting now, Cyan entered the entertainment district, where laughter and music filled the air. The vibrant atmosphere contrasted sharply with the city's underlying rot. His eyes swept across the revelers, his expression hardening. "This city is rotten to the core," he thought. "Time to uncover its roots." Determined, he stepped into an establishment where Delkia awaited him. She greeted him warmly, leading him to a discreet, dimly lit room. Offering a charming smile, she handed him a teacup and sat beside him, her hand slipping onto his arm. The tea emitted a peculiar energy, its aroma a mix of sweetness and mint, masking the telltale scent of Garam's infamous paralysis medicine. Cyan's gaze lingered on the cup, his mind racing. Not even trying to hide it, he thought with mild amusement. Delkia twirled her hair nervously. "Thank you for accepting my invitation," she said in a slightly shaky voice. "I'm sure you'll enjoy tonight." Cyan brought the teacup to his lips, his sharp gaze never leaving hers. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Oh, I'm sure this night will be enjoyable," he said coolly, "just like this tea. It has a very special aroma." Delkia froze, her heart skipping a beat. Her confident facade wavered. "Does he know?" she wondered, panic rising. His tone was unreadable, his words cutting. Cyan lifted the cup and drank deeply. Delkia's jaw dropped in disbelief. "Is he actually drinking it?" she thought, her confusion mingling with a growing sense of triumph. Moments later, Cyan let the teacup slip from his fingers, the ceramic shattering on the floor. His body slumped forward, falling against Delkia's shoulder. Her initial shock gave way to pride as a victorious smile spread across her face. "He's mine now," she thought smugly, her confidence restored. Meanwhile, in the commercial district, word of Delkia's supposed success reached the Gray Merchants Union. A butler entered Morris's dining hall, bowing slightly as he placed a hand over his chest. "A message from the entertainment district," he announced. "Delkia has captured Simon." Morris, dining with calm precision, set down his fork. His lips curled into a pleased smile, though his eyes flashed with fury at the thought of wasted opportunities. Gunther was a fool, he fumed inwardly. Losing the gravity chamber like that, I worked hard to acquire it from the Garum Association. To soothe his frustration, he grabbed a chicken thigh and bit into it with gusto. Chewing thoughtfully, his expression shifted to one of unbridled excitement. It doesn't matter, he thought, his mind racing with plans. Soon, the demonic sword will be mine. As Morris dined, one of his men emerged from a swirling portal, his face etched with suspicion. This feels too convenient, the man said, his voice low. Something isn't right? Morris, without opening his eyes, waved a hand dismissively, muttering a spell under his breath to nullify bad luck. Don't worry, he said confidently. It's handled. The man's gaze didn't waver. My instincts have never been wrong, he insisted. I'll go scout the location ahead of time. Morris finally opened his eyes, his expression sharp. Fine, he relented. But don't act rashly. Do only what's necessary. Yes, sir, the man replied before disappearing back into the portal. As he resumed his meal, Morris's thoughts turned to Sparnia's mercenaries. Annoying meddlers, he thought, his brow furrowing. They should stick to doing what they're paid for. Unless they have their eyes on the demonic sword too. Minutes later, Morris's paranoia faded as he climbed into his ornate carriage. As it raced through the city streets, he ordered his driver to clear the way, leaving residents shocked by the display of power. Let's see what Delki has done, he thought with anticipation. Upon arriving at the entertainment district, Morris stepped out of the carriage, his face alight with enthusiasm. Throwing open the door to Delkia's establishment, he announced, I've arrived. In her private room, Delkia had laid Cyan, still unconscious, on her bed. She sat beside him, her cheeks flushed with excitement. You came early, she teased Morris as he entered. You could have taken your time. Her tongue darted out nervously, and she began touching it with her fingers. But I suppose it doesn't matter. The fun's about to begin. Morris's grin widened, though his eyes stayed on Cyan. I don't need him, he said cheerfully. Just the object he's carrying. Delkia smirked, crossing her arms. Don't worry, I've already taken it from him. Hearing this, Morris's excitement grew. Good, he said, extending his hand eagerly. Hand it over. But Delkia didn't comply. Instead, she pulled a rope near her bed, her smirk deepening. Don't be so impatient. You're in for a surprise. The curtains in the room parted slowly, revealing a shocking scene. A figure with white hair was bound by a red fog, their arms suspended in midair. Around them lay the mutilated bodies of several men. In the middle of the carnage was Delkia's body, tied by her wrists, her face bruised and lifeless. Morris's confident demeanor crumbled instantly. His face paled as sweat began to bead on his forehead. What is this? He stammered, his voice trembling with fear. Delkia, standing near him, extended her hand toward the grotesque display. Isn't this what you wanted? She asked mockingly. Her voice dripped with malice as she gestured toward the horrifying scene. Morris's eyes darted frantically, piecing together the nightmare before him. She's dissecting humans, he realized in horror. As he looked closer at the figure in the middle, his body began to tremble uncontrollably. That's Delkia's body. The smugness vanished from Morris's face, replaced by sheer terror. He finally understood that he wasn't in control, and that he had walked straight into a trap. Morris spun around, his expression a mix of confusion and fear. Staring at the false Delkia, he demanded, Who are you? The woman smirked, unfazed by his outburst. Don't be so rude, she replied, her voice calm yet chilling. Slowly, she ran her hand across her face, causing the disguise to dissolve. The woman beneath the illusion was none other than Kiram. Once her true form was revealed, Kiram's smile widened as she locked eyes with Morris. I'm the demonic sword you've been so desperate to possess, she said, her tone dripping with mockery. Morris's jaw dropped as the realization hit him like a brick. His legs gave out, and he fell onto the floor, staring at Kiram in utter disbelief. Impossible. The demonic sword can turn into a human. Kiram chuckled softly, clearly enjoying his reaction. Her presence exuded an unshakable confidence that only deepened Morris's dread. Suddenly, Cyan, who had been feigning paralysis, sat up, his intense gaze locking onto Morris. You know too much, he said coldly, his voice cutting through the tension. Morris's heart sank. His instinct screamed that he was in over his head. Desperate, he shut his eyes and screamed at the top of his lungs, calling for the Shadow Assassin squad. Help! Get in here now, he bellowed. Cyan, visibly annoyed, covered his ears. This guy's way too noisy, he muttered. Before Morris could continue his shrieking, Cyan closed the distance and delivered a swift blow to his neck. Shut up, Cyan said bluntly as Morris crumpled to his knees. Rolling up his sleeves, Cyan's expression turned darker. Since you're so eager to see your men, he said with a cruel smile, I'll send you to meet them. Cyan extended his arms outward, releasing a dense, menacing fog that quickly filled the room. Using his swamp of mist ability, Cyan turned Morris's shadow into a swirling pool of darkness that began to consume his body. Morris's panic escalated as he felt his body being pulled into the shadowy abyss. Cyan stepped closer, his piercing eyes studying him. You gave Gunther the artifact and Delkia the paralyzing medicine, didn't you? He asked rhetorically, his tone icy. Morris, his voice trembling, begged for mercy. I'll never do it again. Please, I'm sorry. Cyan smiled faintly, though the warmth never reached his eyes. I'll make sure you never can, he said, bidding him farewell. The shadow fully enveloped Morris, dragging him into its eerie depths. Desperate, Morris extended a hand upward, pleading for forgiveness. His cries echoed faintly as he vanished into the darkness. Within the shadow, Morris collided with something cold and lifeless. Turning in fear, he saw the body of one of the assassins from the Shadow Assassin Squad. His heart pounded as the realization hit him. He was already trapped in the same grave he had dug for others. Clutching his neck, Morris gasped for air, his fear mounting until the shadow consumed him completely. As the fog dissipated, Cyan turned away, his mind already shifting to the next target. Delkia is next, he muttered. Kiram approached Cyan, her steps deliberate and calm. Leave her to me, she said with a soft but firm tone. Cyan glanced at her, reading the seriousness in her expression. With a nod, he stepped aside, leaving the room and trusting Kiram to handle the final piece of the puzzle. Cyan hesitated, but ultimately decided to trust Kiram, though his expression betrayed his concern. Don't cross the line, he warned her, his voice firm. Kiram smiled reassuringly. I promise I won't, she said sweetly, though the gleam in her eyes hinted otherwise. She turned toward Delkia, placing a hand on her waist as she leaned in. How dare you lay a finger on my owner, she whispered coldly. Delkia, her face battered and bruised, slowly regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, only to meet Kiram's unrelenting gaze. Kiram's smile widened with emotion as she began cracking her knuckles. Oh, good, she said, her voice tinged with malice. You're awake. Perfect. Get ready, I'm going to divide you into 1,000 pieces. Delkia's eyes filled with terror, and she began to tremble. Tears streamed down her face as she begged for forgiveness, her voice shaking. Please, I swear I won't ever do anything like that again. Kiram wasn't moved by her pleas. With no hesitation, she delivered a powerful punch to Delkia's face, sending her reeling with a scream of pain. Cyan left the room, his steps slow but steady. As Delkia's cries echoed behind him, his expression grew serious. His gaze drifted to the door for a moment before he shook his head and moved on. She'll handle it, he thought. But just as he turned away, his senses sharpened. He felt a familiar mana nearby, one that sent a chill down his spine. Stopping abruptly, Cyan's eyes widened in disbelief. The world around him seemed to shift as he found himself in an entirely different place. Looking around, he realized he was in a domain of the fog. A thick, blue mist began to gather, swirling unnaturally. Cyan's instincts screamed at him that this was bad. The fog seemed alive, its presence oppressive and disorienting. Cyan's heartbeat quickened as he braced himself. From the fog, a soft laugh echoed, mocking his reaction. What's the matter? The voice teased. You look scared. The blue mist coalesced into a single point above him, taking on a humanoid form. Descending gracefully to the ground was none other than Linza Nyloff, one of Lambaster's managers. Cyan stared at her, stunned. His fear was palpable. She's part of the mist too, he thought. His mind raced to process what was happening. Linza's gaze was calm, her smile serene. It seems Sarika hasn't told you much about me, she said lightly. Her voice carried an air of confidence as she studied Cyan. So, this is why you're going around killing the other city managers? She landed softly on the ground, her movements deliberate. Cyan extended his hand, releasing fog of his own in preparation. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with determination. Thanks for coming, he said sarcastically. Saves me the trouble of looking for you. Linza's smile didn't falter. Oh, how polite of you, she replied mockingly. Cyan's lips curled into a smirk. Should I call you senior colleague? Then, he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Or maybe just traitor? Linza's expression remained composed as she held up a ring, the red fog swirling ominously around it. Her smile grew more confident as she responded, Don't misunderstand. I'm not the one who's going to fight you. Cyan's instincts flared as something approached him at great speed. Spinning around, he barely deflected an incoming attack in time. His gaze darted to the attacker, his body tensing. A smile played on Linza's lips as she casually said, Why don't you say hello? Cyan's eyes widened in shock as he recognized the figure. Lisa. he thought, his voice caught in his throat. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. Linza's body pulsed with energy as she observed him with amusement. "You two know each other, don't you?" she asked knowingly. Lisa's stance was aggressive, her knife gleaming in the misty light. Her gaze, filled with hatred, locked onto Cyan. "Simon," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll eliminate you." Without warning, Lisa launched herself at Cyan. Her attacks were relentless, each strike aimed with deadly precision. Cyan enveloped his hands in fog, blocking each blow, but her ferocity made him falter. "Lisa, stop," he pleaded. "This has nothing to do with you. My fight is with Linza." But Lisa didn't waver. Her piercing eyes bore into him as she delivered another powerful strike. Cyan gritted his teeth, realizing she wasn't listening. "There's no choice," he thought grimly. As her relentless attacks continued, Cyan's glowing eyes narrowed with determination. He surged toward her, deciding to knock her out before she could do any more damage. Cyan activated his wave of bloodthirst technique, joining his hands and unleashing a burst of concentrated energy. The wave struck Lisa with immense force, sending her flying backward. For a moment, Cyan thought it was over, but to his surprise, she recovered mid-air, landing gracefully. Lisa braced herself with her hands and feet, stopping her momentum. Despite the direct hit, she stood tall, her gaze never leaving Cyan. "She's still standing," Cyan muttered, a hint of admiration creeping into his voice. "She's been trained thoroughly. Too thoroughly." Lisa dusted herself off, her expression unyielding. Her strength was undeniable, and Cyan realized she had withstood an attack that should have incapacitated most opponents. As Cyan prepared for another round, Linza approached with her arms behind her back, her smile infuriatingly serene. "Why did you hesitate?" she asked teasingly. "You could have killed her if you wanted." Cyan's gaze shifted to Linza, calm but firm. "How much longer are you going to hide in the fog?" he asked coldly. Linza chuckled, her smile growing wider. "Oh, I'm just here to watch. I wanted to see how the boy Sarika trained would fare against Lisa, who was trained by me." Cyan's expression turned serious. "You know Sarika?" he asked, his voice low with suspicion. "What's your relationship with him?" Linza's form began to fade into the fog, her voice carrying a playful tone. "That's a story for another time," she said cryptically. "For now, focus on what's in front of you." Her words snapped Cyan out of his trance. His focus returned to Lisa, who was already preparing for another attack. Cyan went on high alert, bracing himself for the next move. "I'll have to end this quickly," he thought, steeling himself for the battle ahead. Lisa activated her Rain of Needles ability, summoning an array of knives that hovered in the air. Her piercing gaze locked onto Cyan, and with a swift motion, she launched the knives at him. Cyan moved with precision, dodging the barrage effortlessly. He backflipped out of harm's way and landed gracefully. But as he was regaining his footing, Lisa took the opportunity to leap into the air, descending with another powerful strike. Using all her strength, she slashed downward. Cyan, quick to react, wrapped his hands in mana and raised his arms to block the attack. The blade met his defense, and though her assault was powerful, Cyan held steady. Lisa's hands trembled as she pressed against him, her eyes filled with hatred. "You'll pay," she hissed, her voice shaking with emotion. "Gunther was my last remaining family, and you took him from me?" Cyan, gripping the blade with his mana-wrapped hands, remained calm. His sharp gaze locked onto Lisa's eyes. Something clicked. This isn't just her hatred, he realized. It's Linza's influence. The faint flicker of Linza's meddling became apparent as Cyan pieced it together. A fragment of memory, he thought, planted to twist her feelings. This was a trap from the start. Recognizing the danger of staying close, Cyan moved with incredible speed. Before Lisa could react, he grabbed her by the neck, lifting her off balance. Shock flashed across her face as Cyan hurled her onto her back. She hit the ground hard, and before she could recover, Cyan climbed on top of her, forcing her to drop her knife. Lisa's panic mounted as Cyan gripped her neck tightly. Using his other hand, he delivered a decisive blow to her head. Her body went limp as she lost consciousness. Cyan let out a small sigh of relief, his plan to incapacitate her successfully executed. Standing up, his expression darkened as he addressed the mist swirling in the air. "That's one down," he said coldly. "Now, it's just the two of us." The mist above began to gather, swirling ominously before forming the shape of Linza. She descended gracefully, her calm smile never faltering. "What are you talking about?" she asked mockingly. "I thought you knew. This fog is me." Cyan's sharp eyes followed her movements, his expression unreadable. "I'll admit," he said, "I was surprised you were fogged. But what surprises me more is how far you'll go to pretend." Linza tilted her head, confusion flickering across her face. "Pretend?" she echoed. "What are you talking about?" Cyan pointed at her, a confident smile spreading across his lips. "That ring on your finger," he said, his voice steady. "It's the Ring of Anbaris, an artifact that lets its wearer absorb mana or divine authority. You've been using it to mimic fog." Linza's calm demeanor cracked slightly as her gaze turned alert. "He knows," she thought, her mind racing. Cyan ran a hand over his neck, his confident smirk unwavering. "I don't know how you got it," he continued, "but one thing is clear. You're an imposter." The air between them grew tense as Linza's confusion deepened. She could no longer feign ignorance. Cyan's sharp insight had exposed her ploy, leaving the mistborn figure on edge. "What will you do now?" Cyan asked, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. Linza, her composure shattered, raised her hand to display the Ring of Anbaris, which emitted a powerful blue fog. Her eyes burned with fury as she ordered Cyan to submit under absolute power. Cyan remained calm, watching her with measured intensity. She's already fallen into the trap, he thought, but before he could act, Linza activated the ring's mist barrier ability. A powerful barrier of black and blue mist expanded rapidly, trapping Cyan and the unconscious Lisa within. Linza descended gracefully, her confident smile returning. "This is a realm only I can control," she declared. "Here, I reign supreme." Her voice dripped with pride as she approached Cyan. "How does it feel to be powerless?" With a dramatic flourish, Linza summoned a dagger, its blade shimmering with unnatural energy. "It's time for you to say goodbye to this world," she said, preparing to strike. But just as Linza raised her weapon, an unfamiliar voice broke through the tension. "How fortunate I am to find you here," the voice said, filled with quiet menace. Linza's eyes widened in fear and confusion. "What?" she whispered, her gaze darting around the misty realm. A crack formed behind her, the air splitting apart with a sinister groan. Linza began to sweat, panic creeping into her features. Emerging from the crack was Kiram, her expression simmering with anger. Linza tightened her grip on her dagger and turned to face the intruder. Upon seeing Kiram, her fear deepened. She broke into my realm?" Linza stammered internally. The realization hit her hard. She's as strong as Eru, the god of black mist. Kiram stepped through the rift, her posture casual yet intimidating. She placed a hand on her hip, her piercing gaze fixed on Linza. "Why is it," Kiram began, her voice deceptively sweet, "that people keep chasing what's mine? Tell me, Linza, how many pieces should I cut you into?" Linza's expression faltered as recognition dawned. "The demonic sword." "Kiram," she whispered, her mind reeling. She braced herself, going on full alert. The possibility of facing someone with power akin to a god was a terrifying prospect. Kiram's confident grin widened. "Let's start by getting rid of this mess," she said, snapping her fingers. The misty realm trembled violently as cracks spread across the barrier Linza had created. Within moments, the barrier shattered, its pieces dissolving into nothingness. Linza looked up in panic, her eyes darting frantically as the realm collapsed around her. "How?" she thought, terror gripping her. "She destroyed my realm so easily." The power of the ring faded, and Cyan found himself freed from its effects. Stretching slightly, he turned to Kiram with a calm expression. "What took you so long?" he asked, his tone dry. Kiram, already irritated, turned to him with a scowl. "Excuse me," she snapped, her tone sharp. "I just saved your life, and you're complaining?" Cyan crossed his arms, his voice steady but faintly chastising. "It could have been dangerous. Next time, don't take so long." Kiram's expression twisted into one of frustration, her aura flaring slightly as she glared at him. "Dangerous?" she repeated, incredulous. "Do you hear yourself right now?" The tension between them hung in the air, but despite her irritation, Kiram couldn't entirely hide the satisfaction she felt at tearing down Linza's plans. Linza, meanwhile, stood frozen, her confidence completely eroded as she realized she was outmatched. Linza's composure shattered. Reaching out to the side with trembling hands, she snarled, "Shut up. There's no way Cyan could be the successor." Her furious gaze fixed on Cyan as she clenched her fists. "There hasn't been a successor in 300 years. A child like him could never be chosen." Kiram, watching with an amused yet puzzled expression, raised a hand to her mouth. "What's her problem?" she asked Cyan mockingly. Cyan shrugged slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I already made her angry before. This is just her usual tantrum," he replied coolly. Linza's eyes blazed with fury. "You're just a child," she spat, her voice trembling with frustration. "There's no way I'll let a false successor like you stand before me." With clenched teeth, she lunged toward them, her body radiating raw anger. Kiram's gaze turned steely as she began to disintegrate into her true form, the demonic sword. The transformation was fluid and swift, leaving Cyan armed and ready. Gripping the blade tightly, he smirked. "You're way too emotional to be a good assassin. he quipped. Linza summoned her strength and activated Accelerating Mist Storm, a skill that amplified her speed. Cyan followed suit, and the two clashed at incredible velocity, their swords slicing through the air in rapid, powerful swings. The sheer force of their strikes sent shockwaves rippling outward, shaking the ground beneath them. Despite her skill, the difference in strength became apparent. Cyan's attacks overpowered her, and with a final, decisive blow, Linza was sent flying backward. She landed hard on her back, her dagger slipping from her grip and embedding itself in the ground. Cyan's form radiated with an intense energy, the power of the black mist swirling around him. His confident gaze bore into Linza as he stepped forward. "Do you still doubt me?" he asked, his tone light but taunting. Kiram decided to assert her true authority, her presence growing even more menacing. Linza, now seated on the ground, watched in shock as Cyan wielded the black mist power. Cyan extended the demonic sword toward the sky, summoning an enormous ball of energy. The fog around him shifted, forming a mask over his face, making him appear even more fearsome. "Go ahead," he challenged, his voice echoing with power. "Block this with your precious ring." Linza's confidence crumbled. Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard. Her gaze locked on the destructive force Cyan had summoned. The energy orb shot toward her, tearing through everything in its path. Linza froze, her body paralyzed with fear. She had no means to stop it. As the attack closed in, Linza's mind flashed back to her past in the Black Mist Temple. A few years ago, Sarika stood before her with a calm, unreadable expression. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her voice steady. Linza, her back turned, replied with a confident smile. "Yes, I'm tired of waiting for the successor to appear in this place." Her tone carried no remorse. Sarika nodded, remaining tranquil. "It's a shame," she said softly, accepting Linza's decision. Her calm gaze lingered on Linza. "But no, I'm not coming to kill you." Linza turned, a teasing grin on her face. "Why not? Aren't I a threat?" Sarika's gaze sharpened slightly. "Because there's no reason to," she replied. "There are far worse people to deal with. Don't worry about it." But her tone shifted to one of quiet warning as she added, "However, the moment you become contaminated by the mist, I'll be the one to purify you." As the energy orb bore down on her, Linza's confident facade shattered. The memory of Sarika's promise rang in her mind, and for the first time in years, she felt truly afraid. Cyan's unrelenting attack left her no room for escape, and the moment of reckoning drew closer. Linza trembled in fear as Cyan's devastating attack pierced her defenses, severing her fingers and leaving a gaping hole in her body. Her strength waned as she collapsed to the ground. How did it come to this? She thought, her gaze empty. Her mind raced back to the moment she had turned her back on Sarika, driven by her ambition to create her own organization, where the powerful could rise and rule. In the past, Sarika's calm, piercing expression had lingered as Linza turned away. "Take care of yourself," Sarika had said, her voice measured but firm. For a moment, Linza hesitated, a small smile breaking through her confident facade. She had walked away, leaving the organization that waited for the successor, determined to forge her own path. Hidden ambitions had fueled her, ambitions to step out of the shadows and command her own power. Now, kneeling before Cyan, Linza's head hung low, her voice barely audible. "Sarika," she murmured, the name escaping her lips like a whispered regret. Her trembling gaze lifted to meet Cyan's. Tears streamed down her face. "Tell Sarika, I was wrong." Her voice cracked, the admission cutting deeper than any wound. "Please end this quickly." Cyan, his expression calm yet solemn, extended his hand toward her. Her body began to dissolve into mist, her form dissipating as the remnants of her existence faded. Cyan's eyes fixed on the transformation, his thoughts heavy. "No one can predict their own downfall," he mused. "It's happened to me before, too." As Linza's life ended, the misty domain she had created began to dissolve, revealing the world outside. Cyan raised his head and surveyed his surroundings. One of the buildings stood out. It was the Lambaster Cage Hotel. Though unsure how he had ended up here, he was relieved. "At least this saves me some time," he thought. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet, pained voice. "Why did you spare her life?" Cyan turned to see Lisa, standing amidst the dissipating mist. Her injuries were evident as she clutched a wound on her arm, her gaze burdened with guilt. "She tried to kill you," Lisa said, her voice tinged with confusion. "And she knew about the miss. Why would you let her live?" Cyan regarded her silently, his calm eyes betraying no emotion. Lisa, overwhelmed with guilt, looked away. "There's no reason for you to keep me alive either," she said, her voice trembling. Cyan stepped closer, his gaze sharp and unyielding. "Are you planning to tell anyone about me?" he asked bluntly. Lisa froze, her breath hitching. No, she said softly. I won't tell anyone. Cyan's expression softened slightly as he stepped back. Then there's no need to kill you, he replied indifferently. Lisa's shoulders sagged in relief, though her guilt remained heavy. Why does he show mercy to someone like me? She wondered silently, her gaze fixed on the ground. Cyan, uninterested in her inner turmoil, turned his focus back to the hotel. There's still more to do, he thought as he prepared for the next challenge ahead. With a tired and confused expression, Lisa asked quietly, "What am I supposed to do now?" Before Cyan could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted him. The door swung open, and the girl from before, accompanied by the guards, rushed into the room. Her face was etched with worry as she ran toward Lisa. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lisa stared at the girl in surprise. The girl clenched her fists, her eyes welling with tears. "You disappeared so suddenly," she cried. Her voice cracked with emotion as she threw her arms around Lisa, holding her tightly. She didn't care about Lisa's wounds or the situation. They had frightened her, and she vowed never to lose sight of Lisa again. Lisa's eyes softened, a light of joy flickering within them. She gently embraced the girl, smiling as she asked, "Are you hurt anywhere?" The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she buried herself in Lisa's arms. "Don't ever leave me alone again," she begged, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard stood silently nearby, observing the heartfelt scene with quiet respect. Lisa, moved by the girl's sincerity, let out a warm laugh. "We were only apart for a little while," she said soothingly, stroking the girl's hair. "There's no need to cry so much." Watching the scene unfold, Cyan's gaze softened. He saw in Lisa a chance for redemption, a path forward where she could make a difference. After a moment, he spoke. "Lisa," he said calmly, "you should manage this district for now. With the other managers gone, someone has to take responsibility." Lisa looked up at Cyan, uncertain. "Me?" she asked hesitantly. Cyan nodded. "Make sure this girl doesn't grow up to become someone like you. Or Gunther," he said, his voice firm but kind. Lisa's uncertainty lingered, but the sincerity in Cyan's words reassured her. She met his gaze and nodded. "I'll do my best," she said, though her voice still wavered. Cyan walked over to the girl and knelt down, stroking her head gently. "Behave well, all right?" he said with a kind smile. The girl looked up at him, her hands clasped over her chest. "Are you leaving?" she asked, her eyes wide with confusion. Cyan stood, his gaze calm and resolute. "Yes," he replied. "Take care of yourself." The guards and Lisa watched silently as Cyan began to walk away, his back turned to them. Lisa, still uncertain about the future, called out, "Will you come back?" Cyan paused, raising his hand in a casual wave. "Maybe," he replied without looking back. Lisa brought her hand to her mouth, her smile bittersweet. "You have to come back," she said firmly. Hearing this, Cyan smiled faintly. "I will," he thought to himself, though his expression held a tinge of sadness. As Cyan continued to walk away, memories from his past life surfaced, the city engulfed in flames, chaos reigning over the streets. He closed his eyes briefly, pushing the images aside. "Not this time," he resolved silently. "Next time, things will be different." His figure disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a district and a city on the verge of transformation. A few hours later, Cyan arrived at Miss Slayer's temple, holding Linza's dagger. He approached Sarika, who was sitting atop a floating stone, her expression serene yet expectant. As Cyan handed her the dagger, it began to emit a suffocating energy, sending a chill through the air. Sarika's eyes widened as she examined the dagger. "You purified Linza," she said softly, her tone filled with disbelief. A small smile formed on her lips. "I didn't think you'd actually manage it." Cyan stood with his arms crossed, his gaze steady. "Did you send me knowing how difficult it would be?" he asked, his tone calm but accusatory. Sarika pointed the dagger at him playfully, her eyes sparkling with joy. "What if I did?" she teased. "You have questions, don't you?" Cyan raised his head, his expression calm but curious. "What was your relationship with Linza?" he asked. "And are you part of Mist too?" Sarika's smile widened as memories flooded back. "Yes, I'm part of Mist," she confirmed. "Linza and I used to train together, back when things were simpler." Her voice grew softer as she recalled the past. "But one day, Linza turned her back on me. She left, taking the ring of Anbari's with her. The ring meant to be passed down only to the master of the hall." Cyan listened silently as Sarika's gaze grew distant, her mind replaying the moment Linza walked away. "She didn't like where Mist was heading," Sarika continued. "So, she left without saying a word." Cyan reached into his pocket and pulled out Linza's ring. Holding it up, he asked, "Is this the ring of Anbari's?" Sarika descended gracefully from her floating stone, landing softly in front of him. Her eyes locked onto the ring, and she nodded. "Yes, it was meant to be mine," she admitted. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of old resentment beneath the surface. Cyan observed her carefully, questions swirling in his mind. Before he could speak, Sarika rested her hand on her waist and smiled. "But I don't need it anymore," she said confidently. "I've grown stronger without it." Cyan's attention shifted back to the ring. He had assumed the entire mission had been about retrieving it. But now, this revelation left him unsettled. So, she didn't send me for the ring, he thought. Then why? Kiram manifested nearby, crossing her arms as her sharp eyes analyzed the scene. Her voice broke the silence. "You're resentful," she observed, her tone flat but knowing. Sarika turned slightly, her back to them. She closed her eyes, her expression softening. "I'm only fulfilling a promise," she said quietly. "The power of the ring, it breaks most minds. People become corrupted by it, unable to resist its pull." Cyan turned his head toward Kiram, his expression betraying a flicker of confusion. "How do you two know each other?" he asked, holding the ring tightly. Kiram didn't answer directly, her serene expression unchanged. Sarika, however, chuckled softly. "It's not about the ring anymore," she said, her voice light but firm. "It's about what happens next." Her words lingered in the air, leaving Cyan with more questions than answers. What promise? He wondered silently. And what is she planning now? Despite his growing curiosity, Cyan kept his composure, silently resolving to uncover the deeper truths behind Sarika, Kiram, and the enigmatic legacy of Mist. Cyan and Kiram stood in thoughtful silence, processing Sarika's cryptic demeanor. After a moment, Cyan spoke, his voice steady but questioning. "Is this some kind of test?" Sarika offered no immediate response, her silence drawing tension into the air. The ring of Anbaris began to emit a sinister aura, its dark energy palpable. Cyan's eyes narrowed as he clenched his fist. "So that's it," he thought. "She's testing me to see if I'll succumb to the power of the ring." He turned his gaze back to Sarika, his expression calm but sharp. "Let me guess," he said coolly. "If I fall victim to the ring's power, you'll purify me too. Is that why you don't like me being the successor?" Kiram, standing beside him, frowned and placed a hand under her chin, her mind racing. Could that be true? She wondered. Sarika finally turned slightly toward them, her smile faint but deliberate. "It's nothing personal," she said lightly. "I just wanted to see if you'll be a disaster for humanity. Or a hero. This kind of test is normal for a successor, isn't it?" Her gaze shifted to Kiram, her tone turning teasing. "Maybe you made a bad choice." Kiram's eyes flared with anger, her voice rising. "What did you just say?" she snapped. Cyan, his own confusion lingering, pocketed the ring. Despite his reservations, part of him believed Sarika might have good intentions, or at least something resembling them. At Lewin Academy, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campus in golden hues. The dean stood by a large window, his arms clasped behind his back as he watched the sunset. The warm light did little to ease the heavy atmosphere. With instructor Nella's sudden disappearance, the students had grown restless, their anxiety spreading like wildfire. Turning from the window, the dean wore a serious expression. "This is a great burden," he murmured, his voice low, "especially for someone so newly appointed. But I trust him." His thoughts were interrupted by the quiet approach of a man. Boris stepped into the room, bowing slightly as he placed a hand over his chest in a sign of respect. "Don't worry, Dean," Boris said with a kind smile. "I'll do my best to be understanding with the students." The dean nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Boris." Boris bowed again before turning and walking toward the door. His demeanor remained pleasant, but as he left, the dean's sharp gaze followed him. A flicker of suspicion crossed the dean's face. "That manna," he thought, his brows furrowing. "It's strange." The dean lingered in thought for a moment before shifting his attention back to the darkening campus, the tension of unanswered questions weighing heavily in the quiet room. Sarika entered the dean's office in a hurry, holding a book tightly against her chest. "Apologies for being late," she said breathlessly, her gaze quickly locking onto Boris. Her face shifted from surprise to unease as she sensed his presence. Boris turned toward her, placing his hand over his chest in a polite gesture. "It's a pleasure to meet you," he said with a kind smile. "I'm Boris, the newly appointed instructor." As he walked past her, Sarika's instincts flared. His manna, she thought, panic creeping into her expression. She turned sharply, her piercing gaze following him. "It reeks of blood," she realized, her mind racing. Despite Boris's composed demeanor, she knew he was dangerous. The dean, still seated, looked at the floor, his expression heavy. "Boris is from the capital," he said quietly, his tone laden with suspicion. "Skilled and polite, yes. But his manna is strange." He looked up at Sarika. "Keep a close watch on him." Adjusting her glasses with a finger, Sarika nodded. "Understood." She resolved to investigate further, her concern deepening. No matter how much he masks it, she thought, the stench of blood in his manna cannot be hidden. Boris exited the office with his usual calm smile, though his aura felt like a specter of death looming over the academy. The next day, a banner bearing the symbol of Lewin Academy was raised proudly in the city. Excitement buzzed among the knights and guards as they prepared to welcome everyone to the City of Harmony. Among the crowd was Princess Erin, walking alongside Leximus, her trusted companion. Erin's eyes darted over the sea of guards, her expression growing tense. "Why are there so many guards?" she murmured, her tone tinged with unease. Leximus, observing the same scene, couldn't hide her discomfort. "It's overwhelming," she agreed. "I heard security increased after the blood banquet, but this is—" Their conversation halted abruptly when someone caught their attention. Standing in a quiet corner was Lunav, her hands resting demurely on her abdomen. "Lunav?" Erin's confusion was evident as she stopped in her tracks. Lunav, noticing their gaze, offered a kind smile. Despite the tension, Erin felt a glimmer of relief. Later, the group strolled through a beautiful park. The peaceful setting allowed Erin to feel at ease. "I'm glad you're okay," she said earnestly to Lunav. Lunav smiled warmly. "It's all thanks to you," she replied. Erin's expression turned guilty. "But I didn't do anything," she admitted, her voice heavy with remorse. "You were locked up because of me." Lunav closed her eyes, shaking her head gently. "I'm fine," she said with a calm smile. "I'm a big girl. Don't blame yourself." Leximus, observing the exchange, placed a hand over her mouth. "You're beautiful," she said, clearly impressed by Lunav's composure and grace. Erin extended a hand toward Leximus. "Leximus, this is Lunav," she said, introducing the two. As they spoke, a figure appeared before them, bowing politely. It was Boris. "Greetings," he said, his voice smooth and respectful. "I'm Boris, the newly appointed instructor." Erin's gaze turned calm and measured as she responded. "Yes, I've heard about you." Her voice was steady, but her mind raced with questions. Why is his presence so unnerving? She wondered silently, sensing that Boris's arrival would soon disrupt their fragile peace. Erin observed Boris with a calm expression as he explained his role. "I teach mana applications," he said, his tone polite. Boris then turned to Erin, extending his hand with a cheerful smile. "Do you have some free time? It won't take long." Lunav's gaze narrowed as she studied him intently. Her instincts told her Boris was dangerous. "Erin," she said cautiously, "wait a moment." Erin, slightly confused, hesitated. "It's just a mana evaluation," she said, her voice uncertain. "What could go wrong?" With a polite bow, Boris assured her, "I'm only reviewing mana ranges. If I may." His hand hovered near her monosphere. Erin complied, summoning the glowing sphere of mana into her palm. As Boris observed the monosphere, his expression darkened imperceptibly. His lips twitched into a subtle, almost predatory smile. Lunav's unease deepened, and she clenched her fists. Something's not right, she thought. Boris placed his hand near the monosphere, his tone calm, yet unsettling. "This will only take a moment," he said as he activated his power. The atmosphere grew heavier. Before Boris could proceed further, a hand shot out and grabbed Erin's wrist, making the monosphere vanish instantly. Startled, Erin turned, only to freeze when she saw who had intervened. It was Cyan. Boris immediately went on alert, stepping back slightly as his sharp gaze fixed on the newcomer. Erin, however, was caught off guard. "Cyan," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with surprise and confusion. "What are you doing here?" Cyan didn't respond to her. His fiery eyes locked onto Boris with unmasked fury, his posture rigid and imposing. What is he doing in Lewin? Cyan thought, his instincts screaming danger. Cyan's mind briefly drifted to the incursion war of the Demon King's army, nearly 1,002 years before Lewin's founding. The battlefield had been a scene of unparalleled chaos. Corpses littered the ground, and monstrous creatures loomed over the land, bringing despair wherever they tread. A lone priest stood against one such monstrosity, raising his hands to the sky as he summoned a golden barrier of protection. The barrier glowed brightly, shielding what few knights remained. But a massive claw, sharp and filled with otherworldly power, struck the barrier with devastating force. The ground itself fractured under the shockwave. The priest screamed, his voice trembling with determination as he poured all his strength into maintaining the barrier. But the monster's power was overwhelming. The golden shield shattered, and the priest was crushed beneath the beast's claw, leaving behind a crater soaked in blood. Nearby, the leader of a knightly unit gritted his teeth as despair filled his heart. Yet he refused to give in. "Reform the lines," he roared to his soldiers, ordering them to press forward, even as the tide of darkness threatened to consume them all. Cyan's grip on Erin's wrist tightened slightly, his fiery gaze not wavering from Boris. The memories of battle and betrayal flashed in his mind, blending with the present. Boris tilted his head, his calm demeanor masking a subtle tension. You interrupted, he said smoothly. I was simply evaluating her mana. I'm sure you were, Cyan replied coldly, his tone sharp. But you don't belong here, Boris. The tension between the two was palpable, the weight of Cyan's words thickening the air. Erin looked between them, her confusion growing as Lunav stood silently, her hand resting on her abdomen, her worried gaze fixed on Boris. What is Boris hiding? Cyan wondered, his mind racing. And why does his mana feel so familiar and so wrong? Amid the chaos of the battlefield, a priest pointed toward the horizon with wide eyes. Someone's approaching, he exclaimed, his voice trembling with both fear and hope. From the sky, Cyan descended, sword in hand, moving with incredible speed. He struck the giant spider-like monster with a series of devastating slashes, wounding it deeply. The creature screamed in agony, its monstrous voice echoing across the battlefield. As Cyan landed gracefully, the captain of the knights stared at him, his eyes filling with joy and relief. The rumors are true, the captain thought, a smile breaking across his weary face. He had believed Cyan was fighting on the western lines, but the timing of his arrival couldn't have been more perfect. One of the priests nearby grinned, his faith restored. Cyan has come to save us, he said, his voice brimming with hope. Cyan, his expression serious, addressed the injured. Step back. I'll handle this, he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The enormous spider, sensing its survival threatened, opened its grotesque mouth and began charging a powerful mana ball. Cyan stood his ground, but just as the energy surged toward him, he disappeared from sight in an instant, leaving no trace. The monster unleashed its attack, a devastating burst of energy that obliterated everything in its path. Smiling wickedly, the spider believed Cyan to be dead. However, a calm voice from above shattered its confidence. Too slow, Cyan said, resting his sword casually on his shoulder. He was perched on the spider's head, his expression one of mild amusement. So this is a special rank monster, he mused aloud. I'm a little excited. The spider's confidence turned to dread. It began to sweat, its fear mounting as it realized Cyan had closed the distance without being detected. Summoning his Void Sphere ability, Cyan extended his hand and began forming a powerful orb of concentrated energy. As the sphere grew, Cyan leaped into the air and hurled it at the spider's head. The sphere hit its mark, obliterating the creature's head entirely. Its massive body crumpled to the ground, lifeless and defeated. From the edge of the battlefield, Boris observed the spectacle. He began clapping slowly, a wide smile on his face. Impressive, he said, his voice filled with mock admiration. It's no wonder Askell values you so highly. Cyan turned sharply toward Boris, his piercing gaze locking onto the man. Memories surfaced, and Cyan's expression darkened. I remember you, he said coldly. You were in the rear guard with Askell. Boris's smile didn't waver. He placed a hand behind his back and approached Cyan, his manner calm, yet unnerving. He touched his cheek lightly, as if amused by the interaction. Yes, he admitted. I heard the northern lines needed reinforcements, so I came to help. But it seems you've already taken care of things. Cyan closed his eyes, his expression hardening as he dismissed Boris's words. Something's off, he thought, but he decided not to pursue the matter further. There were larger battles to fight, and Boris's intentions could wait. For now, hours after the battle, a bonfire crackled in the camp. Cyan placed his sword against a stone, sat atop it, and stared into the flames. The firelight danced across his face as he spoke, his tone calm but tinged with bitterness. Everyone here is on the verge of dying, and this war, it's endless. Boris remained silent, his gaze fixed on Cyan as he stirred the fire with a branch. Cyan's voice grew quieter, more introspective. It's been a year since the Verts commanded the elite knights to deliver the crown to Emperor Enel. And what's changed? The monsters took advantage when the lines weakened. This war has no end. The fire flared brighter, reflecting the emptiness in Cyan's expression. All of this is because of Emperor Enel's greed. If Askell hadn't asked me to come, I wouldn't even be here. Boris placed his hands on his hips and smiled faintly. Risky words, he said, his tone light but layered with something darker. But I understand. I'm in the same situation as you. I can't say otherwise. Cyan's eyes snapped toward him, surprised. I thought the Emperor brought you here. Boris chuckled, closing his eyes as he flashed a confident smile. No, I wasn't summoned by the Emperor. Askell personally selected me for my talents. He believed my personality was compatible with his. Boris approached the spider's corpse, extending his hand as his mana flared. Using his power, he began extracting the lingering energy from the monster's remains. The void sphere that Cyan had used to kill the creature reappeared in Boris's hand. Cyan watched intently as Boris manipulated the mana, shaping it into a smaller, concentrated ball. I collect residual mana and transform it into spheres, Boris explained casually. He held the ball up, inspecting it like a prized artifact. My power allows me to store mana. Useful, isn't it? Fog began to emanate faintly from Cyan's body, catching Boris's attention. His curious gaze lingered, studying Cyan's mana. Unique, Boris thought, his smile growing wider. Cyan noticed Boris's fixation and frowned. Is something wrong with my mana? He asked, his tone wary. Boris held up the glowing mana ball, his expression unreadable save for the faint trace of an evil smile. Not at all, he said smoothly. In fact, it's remarkable. You might just be the person I've been looking for. Cyan's eyes narrowed. He recognized the danger in Boris's words, recalling the earlier moments when Askell and Boris had begun to take an unusual interest in him. The memory faded as Cyan's focus returned to the present. Gripping Princess Erin's wrist, he stepped between her and Boris, leaving everyone stunned. His gaze burned with a murderous intent. Not again, Cyan thought fiercely. I won't make the same mistake. Boris's demeanor shifted, his polite facade masking the tension in his posture. He didn't recognize Cyan at first, but after a moment, realization dawned. His eyes widened slightly as he took a closer look. It's him, Boris thought. Leximus, standing nearby, panicked. Cyan, she exclaimed, her voice trembling. Why are you acting like this? Boris raised a hand, touching his temple as if calming himself. It's a misunderstanding, he said, extending his other hand toward the group. His voice remained soothing. I'm simply checking the students' skill levels, as any good instructor would. Cyan's piercing gaze didn't waver. I've never heard of any instructor needing to do something like this, he said coldly. His firm tone made it clear he didn't buy Boris's explanation. You don't belong here. The weight of Cyan's words hung heavily in the air, the tension between the two palpable. Boris's charm couldn't hide the creeping suspicion Cyan had of his true motives. Whatever his game is, Cyan thought, I won't let him play it here. Boris raised his hands in a placating gesture, a kind smile on his face. Please, there's no need to do anything if you feel pressured, he said gently, turning to Princess Erin. My apologies if I made you uncomfortable. Erin, still flustered, placed a hand near her mouth. Her cheeks were red as a tomato as she nodded quickly. It's all right, she stammered, clearly embarrassed. Cyan's hostile gaze didn't soften. You should leave, he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. Before anyone feels even more uncomfortable. Boris hesitated, his polite facade momentarily faltering. With a nervous smile, he decided not to push further. Bowing slightly, he placed a hand over his chest and said, Of course. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. He turned and walked away, his steps unhurried but deliberate. Cyan watched him leave, his eyes narrowing as he silently observed Boris's every move. Nearby, Luna's attention also lingered on Boris. Her expression grew thoughtful as she tried to recall whether she had heard of him before. With a serious expression, Leximus turned to Cyan. Let go of Erin's hand, she said pointedly. Cyan blinked, then glanced at Erin. He hadn't realized he was still holding her wrist. With a calm look, he released her hand and apologized. Sorry. Erin touched her wrist, a small smile breaking through her flustered state. I'm sure you had your reasons, she said confidently. Then, as if her composure suddenly crumbled, her face turned crimson once more. She grabbed Leximus's hand abruptly. We have something urgent to do, she said hurriedly before dragging Leximus away, leaving Cyan and Lunav staring after her, bewildered by her behavior. Lunav turned to Cyan, her curiosity piqued. Do you know Boris? She asked. Cyan's expression remained calm. A little, he replied, offering no further explanation. Lunav smiled, impressed. That's incredible. I've never heard of him before. Cyan's gaze hardened slightly as he turned away. Don't try to learn more about him, he warned. And whatever you do, stay away from him. Lunav blinked in surprise at his sharp tone. She watched him walk off, her confusion deepening. Why is he so irritated, she wondered. And why does his warning only make me more curious? Minutes later, Cyan entered the royal hall and activated the ring of Anbaris. Fog swirled from the ring, and in an instant, a mountain of candies appeared. Cyan smiled as the room filled with a cheerful atmosphere. His young daughter squealed in delight. I'm rich, she declared, diving headfirst into the pile of sweets. Her excitement was infectious, and she giggled uncontrollably as she climbed the candy heap. Nearby, Emily, standing with her arms crossed, sighed. She's going to be impossible to handle later, she said wryly. On the other side of the room, Brian stood with his hands on his hips, a smile on his face. He chuckled as Cyan turned toward them. Good work while I was away, Cyan said with a grin. Brian bowed slightly. You've worked hard too. Emily rolled her eyes. He also worked hard at keeping me out of the kitchen, she said, pouting slightly. Cyan crossed his arms, smirking. I thought you liked it when others cooked for you, he teased. Emily huffed, but couldn't suppress the faint smile tugging at her lips. The cheerful exchange filled the hall with warmth, a brief respite from the darker events outside. After Emily sighed and expressed her frustration about being sidelined in the kitchen, Cyan turned to Brian with a mischievous grin. "Let's train," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Brian, visibly exhausted, groaned. "Right now?" he asked, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Right now," Cyan replied, pointing at him with a playful but menacing smile. Despite his lack of enthusiasm, Brian relented and went to change. Arriving at the training field, Cyan and Brian were surprised to see someone already there. A woman wielded a claymore, her breathing labored but steady as she delivered sharp, precise strikes. Her determination was evident in every swing. Brian's eyes widened. "She's handling a claymore of that size like it's nothing," he muttered, impressed. Cyan watched with a growing smile. Leximus, he thought. Her grit and focus stood out, and he couldn't help but admire her. She's going to be one of the best swordswomen on the continent someday. Deciding to test her skills, Cyan grabbed a wooden sword and descended the stairs. As he approached, Leximus noticed him and froze, her expression a mix of surprise and confusion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, unsure of his intentions. Cyan rested the wooden sword on his shoulder, his smile turning playful. "Let's see how much you've improved," he said, challenging her. "Take the first step." Though hesitant, Leximus switched to a wooden sword to match him. But before she could fully prepare, Cyan vanished and reappeared above her, his sword poised to strike. Startled, Leximus barely managed to block the attack. Sparks flew as the wooden weapons clashed. "Good reflexes," Cyan said with a grin, pushing her back slightly. Leximus clenched her teeth as she struggled to hold against his strength. "Why does his wooden sword feel so heavy?" she thought, sweat beginning to form on her brow. Gathering her resolve, she counterattacked, forcing Cyan to step back. Her grip tightened on the sword as she charged at him with newfound determination. "I won't go easy on you," she declared, her eyes fierce. Cyan blocked her flurry of strikes effortlessly, each movement calm and precise. "Good moves," he praised, his voice tinged with excitement. "But is that all you've got?" His playful arrogance fueled her resolve. Leximus attacked with all her strength, beads of sweat running down her face. Despite her relentless efforts, Cyan dodged and parried with ease, his expression never faltering. "Come on," he taunted. "Attack like you mean to kill." Determined not to lose, Leximus's eyes gleamed with resolve as she launched herself into a final, powerful strike. Just as her sword neared him, Cyan sidestepped with lightning speed and struck her lightly on the head with the pommel of his sword. The impact was enough to make her stumble. Her sword slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. Frustration welled up within her as she clenched her teeth, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. She fell back on the ground with a thud, sitting in defeat. Cyan lowered his sword, his amused smile softening. "You've got potential," he said, his tone sincere despite his teasing. "But you're still too rigid. Learn to adapt." Leximus glared up at him, her fury slowly giving way to grudging respect. Though her pride was wounded, a spark of determination remained in her eyes. "I'll beat you someday," she thought, silently vowing to herself. Cyan, reading her expression, grinned knowingly. "I'll be waiting," his smile seemed to say. Cyan pointed his wooden sword at Leximus, his calm smile laced with a hint of seriousness. "Letting your emotions take over creates gaps in your attacks," he explained. "Be mindful of that in the future." Leximus turned her gaze away, her expression clouded with sadness. "I couldn't even land a single hit," she thought, her confidence shaken. Her grip tightened on the sword as she whispered to herself, "It must be nice to be that strong." Cyan, resting the sword on his shoulder, placed his other hand on his waist and spoke firmly, yet kindly. "You're skilled," he said, his tone sincere. "Don't let this get you down. You're already capable of wielding a weapon that even most adults would struggle with." Leximus's eyes widened in surprise. His words carried weight, and for a moment, she couldn't help but blush. Her face turned as red as a tomato, and she stammered, How can you give compliments after beating me like that?" Cyan tilted his head slightly, his hand moving to his chin as he regarded her thoughtfully. "She's not going to understand what I mean," he concluded silently. With a calm nod, he decided to redirect her energy. "Keep improving," he said. "At this rate, no one will be able to beat you in a sword fight." Turning to Brian, Cyan handed him the wooden sword. "You'll train with her," he said. Brian pointed to himself in confusion. "Me?" he asked, his tone incredulous. Cyan nodded. "Yes. Train her." He turned back to Leximus, his serene expression unwavering. "She'll benefit from your guidance." Leximus, still recovering from her defeat, picked up her sword and stood, her uncertainty fading as she switched to a wooden weapon. "All right," she said, her tone resolute. Brian, visibly uneasy, scratched his head as he reluctantly accepted the sword. "Where are you going?" he he asked as Cyan began to walk away. I've got something to take care of, Cyan replied without turning back. Brian sighed, a forced smile crossing his face. Looking forward to training, he muttered sarcastically, glancing at Leximus. Her sudden burst of excitement made him flinch. This is going to be terrifying, he thought. Meanwhile, Leximus's determination rekindled. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. Let's get started, she said enthusiastically, her energy unnerving Brian further. Leaving the training field, Cyan wandered the quiet grounds of the academy. The cool night air carried a sense of familiarity that he couldn't shake. After walking for some time, he spotted Lunev standing alone, her figure illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight. Her posture was tense, her attention fixed on a building ahead of her, the research laboratory of Instructor Boris. Cyan's instincts flared as he observed her silently. Why is she here at this hour? He wondered, growing cautious. He approached her, his steps deliberate, and spoke in a calm but curious tone. Are you planning to go inside? Startled, Lunev snapped out of her trance, her gaze locking onto him. How did you know that? She asked, her voice calm but slightly defensive. All I did was look at the place. Cyan's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, his tone growing serious. You looked at it for a long time, he said, crossing his arms. What are you thinking, Lunev? Lunev hesitated, glancing back at the building. Something about her demeanor unsettled Cyan. He couldn't tell if it was curiosity, hesitation, or something deeper that drew her to Boris's laboratory. This doesn't feel right, he thought, his mind racing with possibilities. Cyan's confusion deepened as he stared at Lunev, who seemed intent on entering Boris's laboratory. Her expression, however, was calm and resolute. I'm curious, she said simply, her voice steady. Memories of Boris bowing politely before them filled her mind. Who is he really, she wondered. Lunev had never heard Boris's name in the Garum Association, which was strange considering his status as an 8th Circle mage. Someone of his caliber should have been well known. Yet he was an enigma. Cyan let out a sigh, realizing she was diving headfirst into trouble. Why should I help you? He asked bluntly. With a sly smile, Lunev pointed at the building. Because you hate Boris, don't you? She teased. Cyan closed his eyes, exhaling heavily again. He didn't respond, but his actions spoke for him. Fine, he thought reluctantly. If she's going in, I can't leave her alone. Lunev grinned triumphantly as they waited for Boris to leave. Hours later, Boris exited the laboratory, moving silently into the night. Once the coast was clear, Cyan and Lunev approached the building. Peering around the corner, Cyan ensured there was no lingering presence. His sharp instincts confirmed they were alone. Stay behind me, he said firmly. Lunev nodded, her trust evident despite her curiosity. Cyan placed his hand on the doorknob and used Basem, a lock-picking technique, to disable the lock. Seconds later, the door creaked open, revealing a room cluttered with piles of books and shelves overflowing with tomes. The duo stood silently for a moment, taking in the scene. What is this? A nerd's paradise. Cyan thought sarcastically. Lunev, however, was already drawn to one of the books. These are about ancient magic, she murmured, her voice filled with surprise. Cyan's expression shifted immediately. A strange mana presence tingled in the air, putting him on high alert. Moving toward the window, that was Kiram. What are you doing up there? Cyan asked, his confusion plain. Kiram, I'm going to the roof, she replied nonchalantly. You go ahead and do your thing. Cyan shook his head, bewildered, and turned his focus back to the room. Cyan! Lunev's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood by an altar, her gaze fixed on something. Cyan moved closer, his curiosity piqued. Lunev placed her hand on a book resting on the altar, different from the others in every way. Its cover was old and worn, with a gemstone embedded in the center. This isn't just any book, Cyan muttered, his tone sharp. His instincts screamed that this artifact was far more than it appeared. Lunev lifted the book carefully, her eyes scanning its surface. As she turned it over, Cyan recognized it immediately. Hearthkriya, he thought grimly. Boris's armor. The realization hit them both like a thunderclap. This wasn't just an ordinary laboratory. It was a vault of dangerous secrets. Cyan's mind raced. What else has he hidden here? On the rooftop, Kiram crossed her arms, her face twisted in disgust. This smell, she muttered, her voice laced with fury. No matter how many times I encounter it, it's revolting. Her sharp gaze scanned the area, her teeth clenched. Come out at once, Hearthkriya, she demanded. Feathers began to drift from the sky, their pristine white contrasting with the ominous tension in the air. A figure descended, a radiant angel with enormous wings and white hair. A smile played on his lips as he landed gracefully. It's been a long time, Hearthkriya said, his tone light. How surprising to see you awake after 3 centuries. Kiram, her fury barely contained, offered a forced smile. I was in a good mood, she said tersely. But you've just ruined it. Hearthkria's cheerful expression didn't falter as he studied her. Your personality hasn't changed one bit, he said with a laugh. Perhaps that's why you chose Cyan as the successor. Of all the people, Kiram's composure cracked, her eyes blazing with anger. What are you insinuating? She growled, her hand twitching as if ready to strike. Hearthkria descended to the roof, raising a calming hand. Relax, he said smoothly. I'm here to help. Kiram's mind raced with questions, her expression shifting to confusion. Help me? With what? She asked, her voice skeptical. Hearthkria smiled knowingly, raising a single finger. The gesture only fueled Kiram's irritation. What the hell are you trying to do? She spat, her forced smile returning as her rage simmered beneath the surface. Inside the laboratory, Lunav opened the mysterious book with careful hands. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she examined the contents. I've never seen anything like this, she murmured, her fingers trailing across the page. The text was written in a secret language filled with complex symbols, more like a code than ordinary writing. Cyan observed in silence, his unease growing. What is this? He muttered, his instinct screaming that the book was dangerous. It looks unfinished, Lunav said, her voice thoughtful as she touched an illustration of a sun. Her gaze grew distant as she began muttering. The sun, dark clouds, fog. Cyan's eyes widened in alarm. His heart raced, his instincts sharpening. Without hesitation, he reached out and slammed the book shut, startling Lunav. What are you doing? She asked, confused and slightly offended by his abruptness. Cyan's gaze was steely, his voice low and serious. This book has to be destroyed, he said firmly. Lunav's expression filled with questions. Why? What's in it? She asked, her mind struggling to process his urgency. Cyan's attention remained fixed on the closed book, his body tense. This book, he thought to himself, is responsible for the blood banquet and countless other catastrophes. The tension in the laboratory escalated when a calm, authoritative voice broke the silence. I can't let that happen, it said. Cyan's expression shifted instantly. Turning, his eyes locked onto Boris, who stood at the doorway. His presence was startling. Cyan hadn't sensed him at all, distracted by the cursed book. A chill ran down his spine as he clenched his teeth, realizing the situation had taken a dangerous turn. The book on the altar began to glow with an intense golden light. The radiance was so blinding that Cyan and Lunav had to shield their eyes and step back. Suddenly, the book shot into Boris's hand as if it belonged there. Placing his other hand on his chest, Boris closed his eyes and smiled. I was debating whether to visit you, he said smoothly, but what a coincidence to find you here instead. Though I must say, spying on me is unpleasant. Cyan's anger boiled over, but before he could act, Lunav's confusion deepened. What's going on? She wondered aloud, her eyes darting between Cyan and Boris. Boris's eyes gleamed dangerously as he extended his hand toward Lunav. I believe she should leave us alone, he said with unnerving politeness. In an instant, a burst of energy sent Lunav flying backward. She crashed through the window with a deafening shatter, disappearing into the night. Cyan's heart dropped as he stared in shock, his mind racing. She's safe, Boris assured with a smile, as if reading Cyan's thoughts. I sent her to her dorm. A bit rough, perhaps, but nothing to worry about. The broken window framed Boris's imposing figure as he held the glowing book, now pulsating with golden energy. His expression was disturbingly casual, but his eyes burned with an unsettling intensity. I've been looking forward to this, Boris said, his smile widening. You fascinate me, Cyan. The version of you that the world sees, and the version you keep hidden. Cyan went on full alert, his eyes narrowing. This isn't good, he thought. His instincts screamed to attack, but something restrained him. Hearthkria. The book, Hearthkria, radiated a powerful golden aura that filled the room. Cyan's fists tightened as his frustration mounted. Why now, of all times, when Kiram isn't here? He thought bitterly. Meanwhile, on the roof, Kiram lay with her arms behind her head, her expression twisted in irritation. What is he talking about now? She muttered, her frustration evident. Hearthkria's voice, calm and almost mocking, echoed through the golden light. The person that my owner serves is one chosen by the gods, the book said, addressing Kiram. That means you're on the losing side. Kiram scoffed, closing her eyes as if dismissing the claim. Why would a demonic sword like me side with Lumendal and betray my owner? She asked with venom in her tone. Hearthkria's smile deepened, its aura intensifying. It isn't necessary, it replied cryptically. There are many ways to victory. Golden energy surged from Hearthkria, casting an ominous glow over the area. Hearthkria's attention fixed on Kiram as it delivered a warning. If you steal Cyan's body, it will be difficult, even for us, to deal with you. Kiram opened her eyes, her curiosity piqued. A sly smile spread across her face as she broke the silence. So, she said mockingly, what exactly are you planning to do? The world, as it had always been, was a realm of duality, good and evil, light and darkness, creation and destruction. These opposing forces had clashed endlessly throughout history. Hearthkriya represented the supposed light, and Kirim the darkness, a conflict as ancient as time itself. In the Great Divine War 300 years ago, the angelic forces had triumphed over the great demon god, the forces of darkness. The surface world thrived in the light of victory, but as centuries passed, the memory of these events faded. Monuments like the statue of an angel in the city's center once commanded awe, but now they stood as relics of a forgotten age. People no longer revere the angels or their cause. Hearthkriya, seated casually on the rooftop, observed Kirim, who hugged her knees as she listened in silent contemplation. His radiant eyes gleamed, and a smile adorned his face. The darkness, he explained, makes the light shine brighter. Without darkness, we lose our purpose. Our radiance fades. Kirim's gaze turned sharp. That's the stupidest reason I've ever heard, she muttered coldly, her tone brimming with disdain. Kirim said, if I take over my owner's body and lose control, then you will stop me. Then you guys become saviors once again. Sly smile on Hearthkriya's face as he said to Kirim, yes, definitely I knew that you'd get it. Hearing his answer, Kirim's blood boiled. Her claws unsheathed instinctively as her expression darkened. Enough, she growled. Before Hearthkriya could react, Kirim lunged at him with ferocity. Her claws raked across his face, leaving glowing wounds in their wake. Shock flashed across Hearthkriya's serene visage as he staggered backward, struggling to process what had just happened. Kirim's eyes burned with fury as she snarled. You call yourselves saviors? This is all just your selfish game to stay relevant. Hearthkriya's body began to fall from the rooftop, but his calm smile remained, almost mocking. So much sorrow, he said softly, even as his form disintegrated into feathers, leaving only a concentrated energy gathering in the sky. The angel's voice lingered as golden feathers floated around Kirim. Isn't it your fate, as a demonic sword, to consume your owner's body? Have you changed your mind? These words struck a nerve. Kirim's rage gave way to a cold, cutting smile. Fate, she spat, her voice dripping with venom. You're the ones who decided we were evil. Fix your own mess. Don't expect us to play into your little fantasy. Hearthkriya's energy manifested high above, his face resting lazily on his hand, as if her outburst amused him. What a shame, he murmured, almost wistfully. I thought perhaps you and Eru could be reasoned with. It's been a pleasure, truly. His voice grew faint, and his form vanished entirely, scattering into the night as radiant feathers. Kirim's piercing gaze remained fixed on the fading feathers, her mind a whirlwind of anger and confusion. What did Eru do? She muttered, her voice low and trembling. Hearthkriya's parting words gnawed at her, his cryptic tone implying schemes far beyond her immediate understanding. Still, one thing was clear. She would not be a pawn in their game. Inside Boris's laboratory, the air was heavy with unspoken words. Boris, unfazed, prepared tea and sat at the table. Gesturing toward a cup, he smiled warmly. High-quality black tea from Spania, he said. I'm not sure if you'd like it. Cyan remained composed, his expression calm. Why are you so interested in me? He asked directly. Boris chuckled, extending his hands in an almost exaggerated gesture. It's natural for an instructor to take an interest in talent, he replied with ease. Cyan's eyes narrowed slightly. You barely attend the classes, he pointed out, his tone suspicious. Feigning surprise, Boris tilted his head. And why is that? He asked, his smile unwavering. Cyan didn't hesitate. Because there isn't much to learn, he said bluntly. The air grew tense as Boris closed his eyes, his demeanor still outwardly calm. I wonder, he mused, if the Dean and the Duke are aware of your unique perspective. Cyan leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Let's skip the small talk, he said firmly. What's your point? Boris opened his eyes, his calm expression unwavering. Have we met before? He asked, his voice carrying a subtle weight. Cyan's jaw tightened, his suspicion deepening. Why does he think that? He wondered silently. Boris leaned back, recalling their earlier encounter. His mind lingered on the moment Cyan had grabbed Princess Erin's hand. That look in his eyes, Boris thought. The hatred, it was unmistakable. Smiling slightly, he extended a hand towards Cyan. Your reaction when we first met, it was memorable. Cyan stirred his tea absently, his gaze distant. No, he said finally, his voice steady. It's just as surprising to me that I've never heard of you before. A mage with an 8th grade mana circle should be famous. Boris's smile faltered for a brief moment. His gaze turned guarded. I prefer a quiet life, he said smoothly. Cyan wasn't convinced. He leaned forward slightly. Where are you from? He pressed. A very rural area, Boris replied quickly, his tone almost dismissive. You wouldn't have heard of it. The tension in the room was palpable. Cyan stirred his tea slowly, his sharp gaze fixed on Boris. He's lying, he concluded. Even in my past life, he went to great lengths to hide the truth. Breaking the silence, Cyan rested his head on his fist. Anything else you'd like to know about me? He asked, his tone cool and detached. Boris's cheerful facade returned instantly. It's getting late, he said with a smile. We can always continue this conversation another time. Cyan stood, leaving the table and stepping out into the moonlit night. The broken window cast silver beams across the room, illuminating the tension that lingered even after Cyan's departure. Alone in the laboratory, Boris returned the glowing book to the altar. His fingers lingered on its surface as he observed it in silence. His thoughts churned as he replayed their interaction. Cyan is cold, he thought, his smile fading. So cold it's difficult to know what he's thinking. No wonder Askell felt threatened by him. Turning back to the altar, Boris's eyes gleamed with a new understanding. And now I see why, he mused. Cyan is the one helping Princess Erin. For Boris, the game was only beginning. For Cyan, the pieces on the board were growing more unpredictable by the second. In the dim light of the laboratory, Boris placed his hand on the ancient book resting on the altar. A white feather materialized above its surface, hovering delicately. His expression darkened. The younger brother of the Savior, blessed by Lumendal, wielding a demonic sword, he mused. What a disgrace. Behind him, Hearthcrea manifested, his radiant presence illuminating the room. A sly smile crossed the angel's face. Perhaps it's a matter of destiny, Hearthcrea said, his tone calm but deliberate. Boris opened the book, flipping through its pages, his smile widening with every turn. An interesting way to view it, he replied, his voice carrying a note of intrigue. Hearthcrea turned his gaze outward, his expression thoughtful. As the owner of Kirim, Cyan might be the darkness we've been searching for all this time, he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. Reaching a page adorned with the illustration of the sun, Boris placed his hand over the image. His thoughts aligned with Hearthcrea's words. If Cyan is the darkness, then he will help Askell shine even brighter, just as the prophecy foretold, he murmured. The imagery of the black mist concealing the sun came to mind as he closed the book, his eyes alight with joy. The ascension of the Savior is about to begin, Boris declared with excitement. Elsewhere, Kirim stepped through a swirling portal into the kingdom of Eru, the air heavy with mist and tension. Her boots echoed against the ground as she entered, her gaze fixed downward, fists clenched at her sides. Ahead of her, Eru sat on his shadowy throne, his piercing gaze settling on her. Eru's calm voice broke the silence. Kirim, he said, his tone measured. I wasn't expecting you. What brings you here? Resting her hand on her waist, Kirim smirked, though her fury simmered beneath the surface. She began walking toward him. You already know, she said sharply. I just met Hearthcrea, and I didn't realize how close he was to your domain. Suspicion flickered in Eru's eyes. He tilted his head slightly. Did he try something? He asked, his voice even. Kirim's eyes flared with rage. You knew, she shouted, her voice rising. You knew, and you've done nothing. Her teeth clenched as she confronted him. Did you forget? They're the ones who expelled you. Eru's form dissolved into mist, reappearing behind her with disarming silence. His voice carried a quiet sadness. There is no place lower than the one where I've already fallen, he said. What is left for me to fear? The weight of his words surprised Kirim. She turned, her rage momentarily giving way to confusion. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. Eru's gaze softened as he observed her. You're angry because they want to use Cyan, he said, his tone somber. And you? Kirim's fist tightened. Of course I'm angry. Do you even care? She demanded. This isn't about me, it's about Cyan. Eru turned his back on her, his movements slow and deliberate. Isn't this your wish? He asked, his voice carrying an edge of finality. Kirim blinked, her anger wavering. What are you talking about? She asked, her tone now curious, but wary. With a wave of his hand, Eru summoned a card, its surface glowing with red mana. Using his finger, he began inscribing it, his strokes precise and deliberate. Your wish is to protect Cyan, he said, not looking up. So, I will make it come true. Finishing his writing, Eru handed the card to her. Carry this decree, he instructed. All of Mist will help you protect Cyan. Kirim's cold gaze fell on the card as she took it. Her rage returned in full force as realization dawned. You're not going to do anything yourself, are you? She said bitterly. Has something happened with Lumendals? Eru's silence was deafening, and though his expression didn't change, the weight of his inaction spoke volumes. Kirim's grip on the card tightened, her resolve strengthening even as her questions remained unanswered. If he won't act, then I'll do it myself, she thought, her determination burning like a flame in the mist-filled room. Eru's glowing eyes dimmed slightly, his expression solemn as Kirim's accusations pierced the air. Every decision he had made had been for his daughter's sake, but those words carried no weight for Kirim now. She turned her back on him, her fists clenched in fury. I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses, she snapped, her voice cold and biting. Consumed by hatred, she stepped toward the portal, her glare burning with contempt. Pointing at Eru, she delivered her parting shot. Stay locked up forever, coward. Eru stood in silence, her words sinking deep. Though he remained composed, an undeniable sadness hung over him, knowing that her anger wasn't entirely unjustified. In the city where the angel statue loomed, a solemn ritual took place in a grand hall adorned with angelic effigies. Several women in white hoods lined up reverently, their white hair glinting under the light. At the center stood a leader holding a ceremonial sword, facing a lone knight. The leader's voice echoed through the chamber. Will you, as a proxy of the great god of light, Lumendal, swear to act as a ray of hope against the cruel darkness? She gripped the sword tightly, her tone heavy with purpose. Will you swear to fight and die on the battlefield, should the need arise? The blue-haired knight stood silently, her gaze steady yet contemplative. Alice Vert, after a moment's hesitation, took a deep breath and spoke with determination. I swear to accept the will of the god of light, Lumendal. As her words resonated through the hall, her eyes began to glow with conviction. Yet, deep down, a seed of doubt lingered. Is this truly the right path? She wondered silently. The Empire had been aggressively recruiting talented individuals into the Knights of Light, deploying them to the front lines to face calamities. Even during catastrophic events like the Blood Banquet, the Royal Guard had failed to act effectively. This reality weighed on Alice as she stood before the angel statue, gazing at it with mixed emotions. Joining the Knights of Light had been her dream since childhood, but now that she was here, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Her thoughts were interrupted by a cheerful voice. Congratulations. Startled, Alice turned, her eyes widening in surprise. She couldn't help but smile when she saw her friend Cecilia standing nearby. Cecilia! Alice exclaimed, her joy breaking through her nerves. Cecilia's proud smile radiated warmth as she approached. You've finally achieved your dream, she said with genuine delight. Alice flushed nervously and waved her hands in denial. You're Lady Cecilia now. I should address you properly. Cecilia placed her hands over her abdomen, her tone gentle but firm. Alice, when we're alone, you can address me however you like. Still, Alice knelt before her friend out of respect, shaking her head. I can't. You're my superior now. Cecilia's composure faltered as she grew visibly nervous. Please don't kneel, she panicked, her voice trembling. Later, the two friends sat on a bench by a serene fountain in the city park. The gentle sound of water offered a sense of calm as Alice voiced her concerns. I don't know if I've chosen the right path, she confessed, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Cecilia listened intently, her gaze steady. You've never been one to stray from the right path, Alice, she said softly. I've known you for a long time. Trust yourself. You'll do what's right. Alice looked at Cecilia, her friend's unwavering belief in her lighting a small flame of hope. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but sincere. As the night deepened, the two friends sat in silence, their bond unspoken but strong, ready to face the challenges ahead. Alice, her eyes closed, let out a sigh, her heart heavy with unresolved emotions. I can still hear their screams, she admitted softly, her voice tinged with anguish. People crying for help. Cecilia, standing beside her, regarded her friend with a serious expression. There's only one way to find out if the front lines are where you truly belong, she said, her tone calm but resolute. Alice's gaze shifted, her confusion and curiosity evident. Before she could ask, Cecilia stood up, a smile spreading across her face. Join me when I head to the front line, she suggested, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Duke Villiers has entrusted us with an important mission, one that we must fulfill together. Hearing this, Alice's jaw dropped in shock. Father gave us a mission? She asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Meanwhile, Brian strapped on his boots and gripped his sword with determination. His eyes gleamed as he prepared for the unknown. Where are you going? Someone asked. Brian turned to face them, his expression serious. I don't know, he admitted. I was only told to get ready. Emily, standing behind him, watched silently, her usual cheerfulness replaced by quiet concern. Nana placed her hands over her chest, her gaze sorrowful. Will I not see you for a long time again? She asked hesitantly. Before Brian could answer, the sound of boots approaching drew their attention. A calm voice interrupted. Not this time. All eyes turned to see Cyan, his expression serene yet firm. Addressing Nana, he said, Don't worry. He then turned to Brian, a faint smile on his lips. Are you ready? Brian nodded. Yes, he replied confidently. I've prepared as instructed, but I still don't know where we're going. Cyan extended his hand, revealing the ring, which emitted an intense red mist. We're going to the Valley of Lemia, he revealed. Emily gasped, her face a mix of surprise and confusion. Isn't that the place we went to before? It's so far away. Without addressing her concern, Cyan used the ring's power to open a portal. With this, he said calmly, we'll arrive immediately. He gestured for Brian to hurry, his urgency evident. Brian followed without hesitation, while deep inside, Cyan braced himself for what he knew. This was the day Alice was fated to die. Mounted on horses, the Knights of Light arrived at the front lines. The scene was tense, the air thick with the anticipation of battle. A bearded man, Sir Yulkin, the captain of the squadron, raised his voice, ordering the troops to halt. He turned back to face Alice, a broad smile on his face. "Thank you for joining us, Lady Alice," he said with genuine appreciation. Alice, riding beside Cecilia, forced a smile. "Please, Sir Yulkin," she said, her tone slightly flustered. "Don't call me miss." As the troops advanced, Alice's attention fell on the battlefield ahead, a stark reminder of the dangers they were about to face. Sir Yulkin noticed her unease and turned to her with a reassuring smile. "It's truly admirable that you've come here as a knight of light," he said sincerely. Alice nodded, though her mind was clouded with doubt. "Am I truly ready for this?" she wondered, clutching the reins of her horse tightly. Beside her, Cecilia's unwavering presence gave her a small measure of comfort, even as they rode into the unknown. With a forced smile and a nervous tone, Alice pleaded with Sir Yulkin, "Please stop praising me so much. I still have so much to learn." Yulkin, his scarred eye giving him an air of rugged wisdom, smiled warmly. "You'll do just fine," he said confidently. "The Duke will be proud of you." Dismounting from his horse, Yulkin gestured for Alice to do the same. She followed hesitantly, still uneasy. "And stop calling me miss," she added, her voice soft but insistent. Yulkin chuckled heartily as he led her forward. "The Duke is waiting for you." Alice's heart raced as she approached her father. The Duke, tall and imposing, stood at the edge of the encampment, gazing out over the battlefield. His stoic expression made it clear that his thoughts were elsewhere. Gathering her courage, Alice brought her feet together and placed a hand over her chest in a formal salute. "Alice Vert, eldest daughter of the Vert family," she said with practiced precision. "I came as quickly as I could after receiving your message." The Duke turned to her, his face betraying no warmth or pride. "Today, the third and fourth princes, as well as the second princess, are visiting," he stated coldly. "Prepare yourself." Though his words lacked emotion, Alice's eyes brightened with joy. "Yes, father," she replied cheerfully. Despite his distance, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of happiness. The Duke turned again, his gaze sharp. "They've arrived," he said curtly. Alice turned, her curiosity piqued. A procession of knights and carriages approached, their presence heavy with formality. The atmosphere tensed as the carriages stopped, and the royals began to disembark. The third prince, Fabian Severus, stepped out first. He wrinkled his nose in disgust, muttering, "What is that awful smell?" His younger brother, Nervian Severus, followed, covering his nose. "How can anyone live in such a filthy place?" he scoffed, his disdain evident. Then, the second princess, Violet Severus, emerged with a graceful demeanor. She offered a kind smile. "The Vert family has always worked tirelessly on the front lines," she said diplomatically. As the princes and princess approached, the Duke and the Knights of Light bowed deeply in respect. "It is an honor to host you," the Duke said formally. Nervian, clearly unimpressed, huffed as he climbed back into the carriage. "Let's get this over with quickly," he muttered. "These visits are meaningless formalities." Fabian, however, remained outside, glaring at the Duke. "And what about magical beast attacks?" he asked sharply. "Are there any threats?" The Duke, unperturbed, responded with a confident smile. "Even in the rear guard, the magical beasts here are minor. There's no need for concern." At that moment, the sound of steady footsteps caught everyone's attention. A figure approached from the direction of the camp. The Duke turned, his expression softening into a rare smile of pride. "There is nothing to worry about," he said firmly. "We have the finest knight the Vert family has ever produced." Askell Vert stepped into view, his eyes calm and steady. His presence exuded an aura of assurance, and his tranquil demeanor silenced the air of unease. It had been years since he had last seen his father. Alice's gaze locked onto Askell, her heart a whirlwind of emotions. Curiosity, confusion, and admiration all mixing in equal measure. "Brother," she thought silently, unsure of what his arrival would mean for the unfolding events. The Duke approached Askell, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, a proud smile softened his usually stern features. "I trust you'll fulfill your mission with excellence," he said, his voice filled with rare warmth. Askell locked eyes with his father, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I won't disappoint you," he promised, his words steady and resolute. Fabian's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Take care of the beasts before they get anywhere near us," he ordered Askell, his expression one of disdain. "Unlike them, we are far too valuable to risk." The second princess, Violet, offered a softer contrast. Her gaze settled on Askell, a kind smile gracing her lips. "I trust you to ensure our safety," she said, her tone gentle but sincere. For Askell, her words were a rare honor. His eyes dropped to the ground briefly, his heart swelling with quiet pride. "It's an honor to serve you," he said, his voice subdued yet genuine. Violet looked around, noticing something, or rather, someone missing. "Why hasn't Lionel come with you?" she asked, her curiosity evident. "He's usually by your side for formal events like this." Askell's penetrating gaze met hers. After a pause, he replied with a serene smile. An unexpected commitment arose. "He entrusted me with the task of escorting the twins and you." Though his explanation seemed reasonable, Violet couldn't shake a lingering suspicion. Still, she nodded, choosing to accept his words. "Having Count Askell as our escort is reassuring," she said before stepping into the carriage. The Knights of Light stood at attention, their somber silence creating an uneasy tension. Askell's intense stare followed the carriage as it moved, his expression inscrutable. Alice's eyes drifted to her brother, observing him with a suspicious gaze. Why is he here, she wondered. Askell always escorts the first prince. Why has he come to the front to accompany the twins and Princess Violet? Her curiosity was interrupted as Askell turned toward her. His voice broke her trance. "I heard you joined the Knights of Light," he said, his tone calm, but carrying an unsettling weight. "Top of your class. Congratulations." Alice froze, her eyes widening in surprise. There was something familiar in the way he looked at her, a gaze filled with concealed hatred. It stirred a memory. Alice was 9 years old, celebrating her birthday in her room. Askell had entered, his presence both comforting and commanding. He stroked her head gently, congratulating her on her special day. Little Alice had clutched a scroll in her small hands, her wide eyes brimming with curiosity and joy. "What is this, brother?" she had asked, her voice full of wonder. "It's a level 4 magic scroll," Askell explained, kneeling beside her. "You can't use it now, but when you grow stronger, when you reach level 4 magical power, you'll be able to use it someday." Her admiration for her brother deepened that day. She cherished the scroll as a reminder of her aspirations to grow stronger. Years later, when Alice finally achieved level 4 magical power, she sat in her room, the scroll in her hands once more. She opened it with reverence, placing her hand over its surface. A magic circle began to glow, intricate and beautiful. Before she could fully activate it, a firm hand grabbed her wrist. Startled, Alice turned to see Cecilia standing beside her, her expression stern. "What are you doing?" Cecilia demanded, her grip unrelenting. Alice's confusion mirrored in her wide eyes. "I was just," she began, but Cecilia cut her off. "Do you have any idea what this scroll is meant to do?" Cecilia asked, her voice both protective and urgent. Alice faltered, realizing for the first time that her brother's gift might have held a purpose she hadn't yet understood, and perhaps one far darker than she had ever imagined. In the memory, Cecilia's panicked voice cut through Alice's confusion. "That's a medium-level magical beast summoning scroll," she exclaimed. "If you had activated it, something serious could have happened. You could have died." Alice's heart sank as she realized the gravity of the situation. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she stared at the scroll, her mind racing. Did Askell know the danger when he gave it to her? The implications weighed heavily on her. Back in the present, Askell turned away from Alice and began walking toward the carriages. Her gaze followed him, filled with unanswered questions. The strange energy surrounding him made her uneasy. Why had he done this? What was happening to her brother? She wondered as the carriages departed. The Knights of Light escorted the royal entourage, their movements tense. Inside the carriage, the third prince, Fabian, couldn't hide his irritation. "Did Brother Lionel really assign Askell to escort us?" he grumbled. Fabian crossed his arms, his expression sour. He rested his chin on his hand, deep in thought. "It's suspicious," he muttered. "Could they be plotting something?" Princess Violet sat across from them, her demeanor serious. "Assigning someone as skilled as Askell to protect us is reason enough to be suspicious," she said matter-of-factly. Her piercing gaze met her brother's. "You know what kind of person Lionel is. Prepare yourselves if you want to survive." Her words hung heavy in the air. Fabian and Nervian fell silent, their unease growing. The carriage ride continued, but an ominous tension lingered. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently, rattling the carriage. The twins exchanged worried glances, while Nervian turned to the window in alarm. "What's going on?" he demanded. Outside, Alice sprinted toward the carriages, her expression panicked. "We're under attack," she yelled, her voice sharp with urgency. Her gaze locked on the carriage. "Evacuate immediately." As she spoke, a colossal antararch, a supreme magical beast, emerged from the earth. Its deafening roar sent a wave of fear through the knights, many of whom stepped back instinctively. The sheer presence of the creature created an oppressive atmosphere that made it hard to breathe. Nervian clutched the carriage window, his teeth clenched tightly in terror. "What is that thing?" he stammered. "It's a terrestrial dragon," Fabian whispered, his face pale. Panic flashed in his eyes as the reality of their situation set in. "They said supreme-level magical beasts wouldn't appear here." The antararch struck the ground with massive force, sending the knights flying. The princes and princess screamed as the carriage rocked violently. Alice threw open the carriage door, her voice calm but commanding. "Get out!" "Now," she ordered. The royals scrambled to comply, but as they disembarked, the dragon's massive tail swung toward them with deadly force. Thinking quickly, Alice activated a protection shield, intercepting the tail's attack and saving their lives. The shield shimmered as it absorbed the impact, and Alice's gaze locked on the beast with unwavering determination. "Move forward," she shouted at the royals. "Don't stop." Her voice was steady despite the chaos. This made no sense. There shouldn't have been magical beasts in the rear guard. Consumed by fear, Nervian lost his composure. Without waiting for his siblings or the knights, he turned and bolted into the distance, running wildly in a blind panic. "Get back here, you coward!" Fabian yelled after him, his frustration barely masking his own fear. Alice gritted her teeth, maintaining the shield as the Antararch roared again. "This isn't right," she thought grimly. "Why is this happening here?" She glanced back at the royals. "I'll protect them, no matter what." Fabian shouted after his fleeing brother. "Stop running, you coward." His voice carried a mix of anger and disbelief as Nervian vanished into the chaos. Meanwhile, the princess lay on the ground, shaken by the commotion. As she struggled to regain her composure, her attention was drawn to an ominous presence approaching them. Alice and Violet turned, their eyes widening in fear. It was Askell, his sword unsheathed and his demeanor cold. His gaze, once filled with familial warmth, now radiated malice. "I can protect you," Askell said, his voice calm yet menacing, "if you come to my side." Violet's face twisted with anger. Clenching her teeth, she thought, "You've been waiting for this, haven't you? Planning to kill me in the chaos." Alice, observing her brother's behavior, was struck with suspicion. What had happened to him? Her thoughts were interrupted when a powerful gust of wind struck the beast, forcing it to recoil and giving Alice's shield a brief reprieve. Alice turned to see the source of the attack. "Cecilia!" she exclaimed, relief washing over her as her friend stood ready to assist. Cecilia nodded firmly. "Alice, get to my side," she called. Without hesitation, Alice grabbed the princess by the arm, whispering an apology before pulling her to safety. Violet, confused but compliant, asked, "Where are we going?" Cecilia answered sharply, "Out of here. That's our first priority." Her tone left no room for debate. Alice glanced back as they retreated, her heart heavy with unease. Why had Askell's gaze been filled with murderous intent toward Violet? Panic crept in her mind as she watched him face the beast, unmoving. The massive beast raised its claw, preparing to strike. "Askell, be careful," Alice shouted, her voice trembling with concern. To her astonishment, Askell made no effort to evade. As the claw descended, a golden magical barrier manifested around him, effortlessly blocking the attack. Alice froze, her eyes wide in shock. Such power! Cecilia grabbed her arm, urging her to move. "We have to go now." Askell retaliated with a surge of golden energy, the barrier expanding outward and hurling the beast skyward. The Antararch roared, its body flailing as it was launched. It crashed back to the ground moments later, enraged but undeterred. The Knights of Light scrambled to regroup as their captain barked orders to form ranks. Askell's attention briefly shifted to the fleeing Alice and Violet. Seeing that they had escaped, he clenched his teeth in frustration, his rage simmering just beneath the surface. The beast rose again, its glowing form radiating power as it charged a mana ball in its gaping maw. The intense energy caused the knights to shield their eyes, certain that their end had come. At the last moment, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. "Retreat!" All eyes turned skyward as Askell descended like a bolt of golden lightning. His sword, imbued with radiant mana, sliced clean through the mana ball with a devastating explosion. The sheer force of his strike dissipated the beast's attack and sent shockwaves rippling through the battlefield. Askell landed gracefully, gripping his sword tightly. His eyes locked onto the beast with unyielding determination. This thing was a nuisance, nothing more. The Antararch roared, baring its fangs as it prepared for another attack. Askell smirked coldly, his voice low but resolute. "You made me lose sight of my target," he muttered. "I won't let it happen again." With golden mana surging through his blade, Askell prepared to deliver a finishing blow. The battlefield was chaos, but the scene near Alice Vert was even more chilling. Her brother, Askell, waged war against the monstrous Antararch in the distance, his golden barrier shaking the earth with its radiance. Yet the real storm was brewing far closer. As Alice turned to help the fallen princess, her concern was genuine. Extending a hand, she asked, "Are you hurt?" The princess, feigning weakness, gazed at the ground with sweat dripping from her brow. But her eyes suddenly lit with malice. A proud, twisted smile spread across her face. I don't fall so easily, she hissed. Alice froze, her confusion palpable. Before she could process the change, a sharp pain tore through her abdomen. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. Turning slowly, she saw the blade, Cecilia's blade, buried deep in her stomach. Cecilia, why? Alice's voice trembled, filled with betrayal and disbelief. Cecilia remained silent, sweat pooling on her brow, her gaze fixed on the ground. She yanked the sword free, the motion cold and deliberate. Blood sprayed, and Alice collapsed onto the ground, clutching her wound, writhing in agony. The princess approached, arms crossed, a smug smile on her lips. Her gaze was piercing as she looked down at Alice. So, you're Askelvert's little sister, she sneered. I knew something was off when Lionel didn't show up. He always has a hand in everything. Her tone was calm, but laced with venom. She turned to Cecilia, who stood frozen, guilt and horror battling in her mind. The princess dismissed her ally's hesitation with a glance, then continued, You Vert are always so ambitious. Did you think I wouldn't notice your pathetic attempts to protect me? Askel's little sister, trying to play hero. Alice's breathing was labored, her vision narrowing. It's a misunderstanding, she whispered, her voice faltering. I only wanted to keep you safe. The princess interrupted with a laugh, mocking Alice's sincerity. Oh, save it. Do you think I'm blind to your family schemes? I won't let you or your brother kill me like a fool. With a flourish, the princess produced a scroll, unfurled it, and threw it to the ground. A magic circle ignited beneath her feet, the glowing runes casting eerie light over the scene. She turned to Alice one last time, her eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. Pray to Lumendal if you want, little knight, she taunted, her voice dripping with condescension. Maybe he'll save you. But I doubt it. The circle's light intensified, and with a flash, the princess and Cecilia vanished, leaving Alice bleeding and alone. Lying on the cold earth, Alice clenched her teeth against the searing pain. Her mind raced, replaying every moment that had led her here. Was her trust in Cecilia misplaced? Did her brother know all along? Tears welled in her eyes, not from the pain of her wound, but from the ache of betrayal. As the betrayal set in, Alice's eyes blazed with rage and sorrow. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her wound, disbelief and despair swirling within her. Why? She wondered. Why had Cecilia, her dearest friend, turned against her? Even as she cried, Alice refused to give in. The ground trembled under the stomps of approaching monsters. Turning, she saw a pack of grotesque beasts with dog-like heads closing in, their intent to devour her clear in their predatory stares. With gritted teeth, Alice drove her sword into the ground for support, willing herself to rise. I won't die here, she muttered, one hand clutching her abdomen to staunch the bleeding. She staggered upright, her heart pounding with a fierce determination. Her fingers twitched as she began channeling her energy. She wasn't ready to let go, not without answers. She would survive. She had to. The monsters lunged at her. Alice gripped her sword tightly and drew on her own blood, channeling Yin's power. Her crimson lifeblood swirled in the air, forming razor-sharp spears that hovered protectively around her. Closing her eyes and steadying her breathing, she extended her hand, summoning the last reserves of her strength. I'll ask you myself, Cecilia, she whispered, as the first beast leapt forward. Alice thrust her hand outward, sending a blood spear hurtling into the monster. It yelped and collapsed mid-air, its body convulsing as it hit the ground. The other beasts hesitated, growling and circling her warily. Come on, then, Alice shouted, her voice defiant. Her spears hovered like a barrier around her, as she prepared to fight for her life. Miles away, Princess Violet appeared in a luxurious chamber as a glowing magic circle faded beneath her feet. She sat on the plush bed, exhaling deeply. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to feel relieved. That place was vile, she muttered, fanning herself dramatically. Even the air was disgusting. Cecilia stood nearby, silent and tense. Her shoulders were stiff, her gaze fixed on the floor. Violet, noticing her companion's quiet demeanor, turned toward her. Don't you agree, Cecilia? Yes, Cecilia replied, her voice faint, her eyes brimming with regret. Her mind betrayed her as memories surfaced. Alice's laughter as they shared ice cream in their youth, her bright eyes full of happiness. The stark contrast to the bloodied, betrayed woman she had left behind twisted like a knife in Cecilia's heart. Violet tilted her head, her tone turning sharper. Why didn't you kill her? Cecilia snapped out of her reverie, her head whipping toward the princess. What? You heard me. Violet's calm, yet icy gaze pierced her. You could have ended Alice right then and there. That was the order, wasn't it? She gestured dismissively. You left her alive. Cecilia turned her face away, her hands trembling slightly. The beasts, They'll finish her soon enough. On the battlefield, Alice's blood-forged swords pierced through beast after beast. Her strength was waning, her breath ragged, but she pushed forward, determined. Just as she prepared to attack again, exhaustion finally overtook her. She drove her sword into the ground, fell to her knees, and closed her eyes. A fleeting sense of relief washed over her. Was it finally over? But the moment of peace didn't last. As she stared blankly at the ground, contemplating what she would tell the knights. Knowing no one would believe that Princess Violet had tried to kill her, a low growl reached her ears. Her body stiffened as a massive beast sniffed at the corpse of its fallen kin. Slowly, she turned, her eyes widening in horror. Salamanders. High-level magical beasts. And they were staring straight at her. Their massive bodies oozed fire and saliva. Their scorching gazes locked onto their next prey, her. Panic gripped Alice. Her mind screamed for a way out, but her body refused to move. One of the beasts reared its head, flames crackling in its maw as it prepared to unleash a deadly fireball. Terror swallowed her whole. She was out of options. Then, in a blur of speed, a figure appeared. Cyan unsheathed his sword, his blade flashing like lightning as he activated the fog sword technique, rushing fog storm. Before the beast could release its fireball, precise slashes tore through its body. Alice barely registered what was happening. One moment she was bracing for death. The next, the salamander's severed head landed behind her with a sickening thud. Her body froze, her mind struggling to catch up. A strong hand grabbed her shoulder. "Sorry about this," a voice said before she was suddenly lifted into someone's arms and carried away just as the beast's molten body collapsed where she had been moments before. Dazed, she looked up. Brian. Relief and confusion warred inside her. The realization hit. If Brian was here, then that masked swordsman. Could it be? The remaining salamanders roared in fury, their fallen comrade fueling their rage. Rivers of molten lava spewed from their mouths, threatening to consume everything. Brian landed in a lower area, placing Alice down against a stone wall. She clutched her head, overwhelmed, while Brian clenched his teeth. "Just hang on," he muttered. Alice lifted her head and froze. Lava was cascading toward them. Then, something unexpected happened. With a loud thud, a sword, Kiram, landed before them. Their eyes locked onto it, puzzled. As the lava threatened to consume them, a figure emerged. Kiram. She stomped the ground with force and scowled. "What's with all this lava? Do they have stomach issues or something?" Hope flickered in Brian's eyes. He grinned. "You're the best." Kiram raised her hands skyward, summoning a powerful magical barrier just in time to shield them from the lava. Furious, she glared at the beasts. "Stop spewing magma like a bunch of sick dragons." With the barrier in place, Cyan prepared to finish the fight. Upon Kiram's command, he activated thick fog third technique, fog descent, vanishing in an instant and reappearing above the salamanders. His eyes gleamed as he summoned a powerful manosphere, void sphere. The beasts, sensing danger, launched fireballs in retaliation, but Cyan was faster. His next move, division, unleashed a storm of magical orbs that sliced through their heads with deadly precision. Within seconds, the salamanders were no more, their bodies disintegrating into nothingness. As the battlefield quieted, Alice and Brian ascended from their shelter. The pool of lava before them still held remnants of the fallen creatures, their severed heads floating aimlessly. And in the center of it all stood Cyan. Alice hesitated, then approached him. She had her suspicions, but she never truly expected. With a trembling hand, she reached out and removed his mask. Tears welled in her eyes. Brian, watching from behind, smiled, feeling a rare sense of peace. Cyan met Alice's gaze, his lips curling into a warm, familiar smile. "Glad I wasn't too late. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one."